thank you all very much for coming. My name's Charles Kenny. I'm a fellow here at the Centre for Global Development and get to direct the Technology and Development Programme here. I'm delighted to be moderating this session on the future of the export-led model with a fantastic panel. Carl is the co-director of the co-director and the Oxford Martin City Fellow at the Oxford Martin Programme at the University of Oxford. Mary is senior economic advisor in the Finance Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice at the World Bank Group. And Bright is president of Pedigree, a company that uses mobile and web technologies to secure products against faking and counterfeiting. They all have fascinating things to say on this topic. My hope is to introduce, ask a few questions of them, and then open it up to a discussion with the floor, because I can see there are lots of people in the audience who have knowledgeable things to say on this issue too, so hopefully we can have a real discussion. So the export-led model, the East Asian miracle countries from Japan through China got rich by developing manufacturing sectors that exported goods. They got a lot of low-skilled workers out of agriculture, low productivity agriculture jobs into higher productivity manufacturing jobs. And manufacturing, as Danny Roderick will tell us, converges unconditionally across countries. So it's a fantastic way to get fast growth. And it allowed for the sort of 7, 8, 9, 10% growth rates we saw in some of the East Asian still see in some of the East Asian miracle countries over decades. There is a fear this model is dead. Developing countries are seeing peak manufacturing employment at rates, on average, much lower than rich countries achieved during their periods of comparatively rapid growth. There are reasons to fear that these manufacturing jobs are going away everywhere, and reasons to fear that there isn't another model out there to promote fast growth. So I want this panel to take a journey, traveling through the depths of the valley of despair that I've just outlined, before at least getting some way up the hill of sunny optimism by the end, before opening it up for discussion. But perhaps we will make it all the way up the hill. It may be too much of a climb, we will see. But let me start, Mary, with you. You have authored a fantastic book on this topic, which is titled Trouble in the Making. It does have a question mark at the end, but trouble in the making. So what's the trouble?
Nice. Shameless. I was actually going to point out the question mark, because I think that's actually a critical point in what we will be discussing today. But I think it was really trying to bring some more of the evidence and patterns and really trying to explore in more depth how much trouble is this export-led model in. Because certainly over time there have been a lot of quite alarmist headlines about robots are coming, they're taking away our jobs, and if it's not the robots, it's AI. And there'll be absolutely sort of no opportunities for Africa, probably in particular, where you haven't had that same sort of move into sort of industrialization as East Asia has had, and South Asia not really so much extent either. And so taking, yours were not as alarmist as some others were, but the numbers were going to grab headlines. And so this was a question of what did this really mean? And as you sort of point out, manufacturing has had a lot of really attractive characteristics for development. So the first is that you can reach scale, that you can export it, so you can grow faster than local demand. And so that's sort of a really key piece of it. It's been a really excellent channel for technology diffusion. So there was an easier, again, this sort of unconditional catch-up, this chance to be able to be more productive. And it had this really nice feature from a development perspective of absorbing large numbers of low-wage, often low-skilled workers. So that is, in that sense, a beautiful development model. So a number of things have been changing. And part of that actually is some of the relative success of countries in that space. So China being the most obvious example. So if you go back sort of 25 years, China accounted for 4% of global manufacturing. Now it's more than 25%. So any other country sort of trying to get their foot in the door has to contend with a very successful large scale, rising in the quality while keeping prices down competitor. And so that makes it much harder for other countries to really be able to get in on this manufacturing sort of ladder. And if you look across sectors, China is one of the top exporters in basically every subsector except refined petroleum products. So it's not just that they're in garments. I mean, they are, and they still are in garments, right? Which has been one of the easiest sort of pathways for countries to sort of start this manufacturing, all the way up, to sophisticated electronics and transportation equipment, and they're increasingly branding their own, right? So they've really been able to move up in the value added, but what's been interesting is they haven't moved out of a lot of the lower value added. So we talk about this sort of flying geese model, where traditionally lower wage countries have moved in on some of that low value added labor intensive, and then have been able to move up into higher value added and higher paid kinds of goods. And as their wages rise, then this sort of moves to the next low wage country. So this pattern is still there to some extent, right? So Vietnam has been able to benefit from that. Cambodia, Myanmar, they're certainly trying. You've got countries like Bangladesh that has moved in a big way into garments, but has been that way for probably 25 years and is having difficulty diversifying and moving up in the same way. You've got countries like Ethiopia that's trying quite hard to get in on some of that garments. But you don't have, so far, the kind of moving out of China in particular than you might expect. So that's sort of one question. And so to me, the trouble came from two parts. One, which others here will talk about too, is this sort of technology changing. So again, the robots, the AI, things that are not needing and replacing this low-wage work. So countries for which low-wage work is more of their sort of source of comparative advantage, what does that mean for them? And the other is sort of what's happening on globalization more broadly. So the pace of globalization and trade exploded in the 90s, partly actually because of technology change, right? So this can be a good thing. So part of it was the sort of ICT revolution, and it enabled better communication, transportation costs. There were some really huge changes in efficiency and in being able to move goods around. So you had this real splintering into global value chains. And so you could, rather than having to make the whole good in one place, you could have hyper-specialization in places. They would do their part, and the parts would move around, eventually get assembled, and then taken to the final destination. And this now is over half of global trade, right? So it's grown enormously, except that rate of growth has really slowed down. And there's some worrying and some not so worrying reasons about it. So, I mean, one is China itself has grown into taking more parts of value chains. And as its own economy and its own consumers have grown richer, they are consuming more of it. So less is being traded because China's making more and consuming more of it. So that's part of the answer. But there is then this question of how much reshoring there may be. If robots really can do this, are we going to see more of this production coming back to higher income countries, for which at the moment the answer, in theory, yes. And you talk to multinational leaders, they will certainly talk about it. In the data, at the moment, you actually aren't seeing it as much. On the trade and globalization side, there's some of it is a slowing down of what was sort of a burst to sort of move to a new equilibrium. So some of that slowdown's not so worrying. But there are other sort of political changes happening in the trade arena, which may make it much more difficult. So I think one of the reports actually that's being launched tomorrow is the World Development Report. And so this is the World Bank sort of global flagship report, and it's actually on trade and global value chains in particular. And I'll steal their punchline. It's actually available online, so you can read more than the punchline. But it is just talking about what an important pathway for poverty reduction trade has been, and that it continues to be, but it's not automatic, and there's sort of two things that need to happen, is that the sort of need for reform is all the greater, particularly for those who haven't really entered into global value chains. And then the flip is that the sort of industrialized, richer countries need to keep trade open, right, to leave those opportunities for developing countries to be able to trade. So it is something that is worrying about what way some of this globalization may be moving forward. But at least the evidence to date is not as worrying. So I think there's a sense of urgency, but not panic in terms of what kind of trouble we're facing.
Carl, make us panic a bit more. You've suggested that automation is taking away the unskilled manufacturing jobs, as Mary alluded to, and indeed that China may be the last to see rapid growth driven by high manufacturing employment. Elaborate.
Well, at the risk of disappointing, I actually agree with everything Mary just said. But I do think, China is already the biggest market for robots in the world. Not robots per capita, it should be said. So South Korea is still leading. There is a lot more room for adoption. But also, manufacturing employment in China has already peaked at 19.2% or so. So it's not at very, very high levels. 12.5 million manufacturing jobs have been shredded over the past 4 years or so. And that is probably in large part due to automation. Now, robot adoption is still very much confined to heavy industry in particular. And I think there are certain industries where you see that, for example, around Christmas, you have this enormous peak in demand, and labor has the advantage, or cheap labor has the advantage of being much more flexible than robots, and it doesn't make economic sense to automate on sort of peak performance level for the entire year. So clearly, certain industries are going to be a lot slower to automate, and I think that leaves a window of opportunity for other countries. Secondly, I think the challenge is, though, that if you look at the frontiers of technology, and I think it's broadly speaking consensus about technological change being skill biased and labor replacing for low skilled type of production of low skilled type of goods and services. If you think in terms of comparative advantage, where does this leave the developing world? And I think that is the challenging part. So many of these countries will probably have to move directly more into higher value-added type of services and manufacturing industries that will require a greater upskilling in the workforce, more investment in education, more institutional improvements, and so on and so forth. And that's broadly where the challenge lies.
Thank you. I should say my 9-year-old daughter just had her birthday party, and she's done her best to smooth out demand for manufactured goods over the course of the year, at least around her birthday. So maybe we just need more of that. Bright, you've talked about and thought about the link between FDI and manufacturing. And in the past, there has been a fairly close link between this export-led model of manufacturing and FDI flows into countries to support the growth of the factories involved. You're worried that may be breaking down?
So if you think about it carefully, and my area really is technology investments into Africa, so that is the perspective from which I'm coming. Though I have a view that it's perhaps the case that these ideas are generalizable to a much broader canvas. If you think of it carefully, these days all the way back to the Dutch Golden Age, and Dutch investments into the UK, or the more interesting example, which is 19th century UK investment into the United States. And you ask yourself, what is the primary selection mechanism through which investors are able to determine the right location to put in their money? And for a long time, the challenge with industrialization theory, industrialization models around the world, particularly in the developing world, the parts of the world where you're concerned about, has been that there's a view the recipient country is responsible for telling you where to put your money. So they spend a lot of money on road shows. They try and build investment climate structures that they believe should warrant investment into particular sectors or otherwise. The challenge is that we have 300 years now of FDI-driven industrialization data, and it's always been the case that investors determine where to put the money. So it doesn't matter what really your industrial policy might be, and we make all of this fast, but the truth is that they decide where to put the money. And we've seen that even in technology in recent times, where only 3 sectors in Africa has received 99% of technology FDI. Fintech, e-commerce, and increasing e-logistics. Now, the truth of the matter is these are experiments, and the one that has the money to mount these experiments determine where those inflows will go. But even more critically, because the birds turn out often, they tend to lose a lot of money, the bears go wrong, the sequencing matters. So if, for instance, the money that had gone into African technology had gone into logistics earlier, we wouldn't have had the huge failures that we've had with the current investment track record in Africa. So almost all the major investments of the last 10 years until recently, we don't know, of course, the current investment inflows. But if you take investments between 2005, when we started to have significant inflows in technology in Africa, all the way to 2018 thereabouts, and you look at returns on those investments, and the results are not encouraging at all. And Jumia's troubles on the New York Stock Exchange is merely a tip of the iceberg. What happened in the 19th century in the US is very instructive, because people forget how, from an ethnographic and a more granular level, how these decisions tend to be made. You had Webster, who was the Secretary of State, and you had Ashburton on the other side negotiating the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. The truth of the matter, though, is that the United States Secretary of State was on the board of Barings Bank, and Ashburton, Lord Ashburton on the UK side, was the chairman of Barings Bank. So this was really integrated elites determining how money can flow. And that's exactly what we've seen also in the technology landscape in Africa. You have these networks of people who came to school in the Ivy League. You have a small group of venture capitalists who decide to trust each other. And in these dense trust networks, money can flow. So regardless of what you do about interest rates, about inflation, and all of those dynamics around investment climate, my perception is that that is not what determines the inflow of the investments. And if that doesn't determine the inflow of the investments, and these bets tend to be very expensive when they go wrong, then the sequencing of those bets matter. If you invest in the wrong thing in a country like Ghana, as we did in the 60s, where we decided to put a huge emphasis on aluminum integration. So we went to the United States and convinced the United States, using a lot of political capital, that they have to put billions of dollars into Ghanaian aluminum integration. We're going to do vertical integration, bauxite through alumina through aluminum. And we did get the money eventually, because for some reason, Ghanaian lobbyists at that time were very good in Congress. The truth of the matter, though, is that the aluminum industry has completely collapsed in Ghana. It's never worked. So my argument is simple. One, how do these selection effects play an impact? What are the nature of the bets that are made, and how do you sequence the bets? And if it is true that these are high-risk activities, then the role of high-trust elites that determine how those inflows will work are very critical. So there's no accident that the role of the Kissinger group in the U.S. and U.S. investments to China heavily conjoined, if you look at it. And then today, as we've had more elite fracturing, you've seen less investment going into China over time. You will see less investment going into China over time. So I'm more interested in how do we build these elite networks that somehow direct money more effectively into the right sectors.
I want to come back on that later and ask you about Chinese investment in Africa, which may be part of a more positive story, but I don't want to get positive yet. Too quick. So, Mary, you discussed the services-led growth model in your books. I mean, if the manufacturing-led model is dead, we need another one, and services seems an obvious place to go. But you've suggested some caution, especially around job creation in services.
So one thing I will answer your question, but one sort of previous thing, in terms of some of the things that Danny, Roderick, and others are writing about, which is sort of this deindustrialization. So I don't think that the sort of manufacturing is dead, right? I think that's an overstatement. He will point to, I think it's 3/4 of countries at this point are, quote, deindustrializing. Which just means that manufacturing or industry as a share of GDP is declining, right? But if you actually look at that in terms of absolute numbers, all right, number of countries and absolute numbers whose manufacturing sector is actually shrinking is 12, 11 of which are in conflict, right? The other was Hong Kong, which is not, it's always an economy, right? So it is exceedingly rare and in very sort of unusual circumstances that manufacturing is actually absolutely declining. So instead, the sort of deindustrialization just means that, for the most part, its services are growing faster than manufacturing. So just in terms, I know that's a little bit of sunshine early in the valley, but it's not the case that manufacturing is dead, nor is it the case that the sector is in absolute terms declining. So services are growing, and some of that is not a bad thing. So if you look at what demand, the demand for services is expected to rise as incomes rise. So it may well be that manufacturing still, there's a large numbers of people in a lot of the developing worlds income are still where demand for manufactured goods is still likely to rise, which is going to be an engine for growth for those markets too. And the thing with services, so I guess two things. One is that they are far more variance than there is in manufacturing. So some of the things, there's some sunshine here too already, is that increasingly they can be traded, or a section of them can be traded. And so again, you get that boost of being able to grow faster than just local demand. And that, I think, is huge. Because for other services that are sort of consumed where they're produced on the spot, you're constrained to only grow as fast as your immediate market would be. To the extent that you can sell to other markets, you can grow faster. Increasing sort of sets of productivity gains are happening, I think, in services. The question is sort of how skill-biased some of these sectors would be. And here I think there's an important distinction between some of the producers of new technology and the services that come from them and users. And for users, actually, I don't think it necessarily has to be so skill-biased. And there's lots of examples from Africa, using very simple phone technology, right? You think about sort of the fintech, right? The well-overused M-Pesa example, but is really instructive, right? Or just the SMS text messages about what prices for your fish or your grains in different markets and helping farmers to go to different places. This is helping people with very low skill. And you think about, okay, yes, I've got a nice iPhone, but you don't need as sophisticated even as an iPhone. But the number of apps that don't require, they can talk to you, they can show you pictures of things. You don't necessarily need to be literate or numerate to be able to use them. So, Uber drivers or, others, you have to get your license. So yes, you'll have to read somewhere on that. But to actually be an Uber driver, it tells you when to go left and right, when you're there. You don't have to even make change, right? So some of these are incredibly helpful for people without as many skills. So they're not the programmers, they're not necessarily the app developers, but in terms of does it all have to necessarily be? No. I think it can be really massively improving the productivity on the lower end. Whether it can do this at sufficient scale, to me, is a big question.
So that sort of raises the point, and it's obvious, but we sometimes forget it in this discussion, that as a rule, automation is good. Indeed, it's sort of development. The greater productivity is what leads to higher incomes, and we should be happy about it. And these new technologies are new ways to make things sort of more productive, which raises the question, Carl. Are we worried about the wrong thing? That actually, what we ought to be worried about is technology adoption is not happening fast enough, and it's the barriers to that adoption that are the problem, not the adoption itself.
I think it's unhelpful or I should rephrase it. I think it's unhelpful to distinguish between consumer goods and technologies that are used in production. So I like my smartphone too. It's easy to use. It's straightforward. It's good for Uber that you have GPS. Uber drivers that you have GPS technology makes their work easier. But I think overall, if you look at the implementation of production technologies in manufacturing and services, those are increasingly skill biased, and you see that clearly in the data. And if it was the case that simply by diffusing, smartphones or investing in faster broadband led to income convergence, we would have seen it a long time ago. And even if you look within countries, within the United States, you are seeing divergence across cities and regions. Incomes are not converging. And one reason has clearly to do with skill-biased technological change. If you look at new job titles emerging in the United States, before the 1980s, they were fairly dispersed across space. Cities with skilled populations only really get a comparative advantage in new job creation from the 1980s onwards. And most of those job titles are directly related to computer technology. So it's occupations like software engineers and database administrators and so on, which overwhelmingly emerged in skilled cities. And even in countries like India, you see that technology clusters in certain places. So I don't think that simply by sort of emphasizing the spread of consumer goods and consumer technologies, and that is going to lead to a lot of new jobs being created. I don't see any evidence of that.
Can I just actually, though, I think you ask it in actually a really important way, because I do think that the risk for a lot of the low-income countries is precisely that they are not going to be absorbing some of these new technologies fast enough. And so, yes, they can be disruptive, and that has to be understood, and there's going to need to be policy response to that. But the risk is the cost will be even greater for not absorbing and not being able to be competitive using a number of these technologies. So, that's not a nice, easy answer, but I think that is a huge risk. So they talk about the digital divide, and it can have a skill component for sure. And it's in part it's rolling out broadband in large parts of the world that already has been closed to a fairly large degree. What's interesting is some data looking at Europe, right, where so broadband has been rolled out to almost all parts of Europe. The uptake on use of it in either e-commerce or in a lot of e-government varies enormously. And it's not because they don't have broadband, they have the broadband, right? So there's other things happening or not happening as to how and why the technology is then being used for efficiency gains, for access to markets, for all kinds of sort of benefits. So I think that needs sort of more attention. But I think that's actually really important, that the risk is the divide will only be bigger if you're not in a position to be able to compete and use this new technology.
This seems like a good moment to bring in your new book, Carl, Technology Chat, available at all good booksellers, which talks a bit about the political economy of this story.
Sure. So let me just start by agreeing first. I think, there are two separate questions there. So one is whether it's helpful to adopt new technologies, and I think basically everybody agrees that it is. So the reason that manufacturing employment is flat in India and around 12% is not automation, right? They have around 3 robots per 10,000 workers. And China, which has invested a lot more in robots, have industrialized much more rapidly. So yes, that is a good thing. But there's also another question, is skill-biased technological change making development more challenging? And I think there the answer is yes, it is contributing to certain headwinds. And I think you ask exactly the right question as to why aren't these countries absorbing these technologies to the same extent, because we've seen it, and this is not a new phenomenon, by the way. We've seen this all over the course of the past 200 years, that not all technologies stick in all places. And one point I tried to make in the book, The Technology Trap, is that when it comes to labor-saving technologies, or production technologies at least, part of it is that it creates both winners and losers. So we know this from the great economist Joseph Schumpeter. It comes with creative destruction. Certain groups don't have any interest in anything that potentially threatens their incomes. And if you go to a country like Argentina, you will find that they don't have many railroads. Part of the reason for that is that the lorry union is very strong. And there are many, many examples in history where resistance to technological change has hindered its uptake. And what I argue in the book is that one reason that economic growth was stagnant for such a long time, and one reason that the Industrial Revolution first happened in Britain, has to do with a shift in political clout and the fact that those who gained from mechanization also in the short run were essentially the ones that gained also political power. So I think we need to much better try to understand the political economy of technology adoption. I haven't seen much work in that field, but I think much more work is
You don't have
to
to
be
go to
done.
Argentina to see underinvestment in rail. You see it here for pretty much the same reason. So, but your point well taken. Right. On this, and sort of particularly following on from Carl's point about how new jobs are concentrated in cities which have a whole bunch of other features that mean adoption is easier. You've sort of made the same point about apps in Africa, that it's because the ecosystem is missing for them to sort of plug into. It's a lot harder to introduce some of these new technologies in Africa. Explain a bit more.
Mm-hmm. So two preliminary points. One is that there is, of course, a measurement problem as well. We do have a reindustrialization trend in Africa, in some countries, in some of the leading countries, that is not sufficiently reflected in the statistics. And I think Robert Lawrence's argument that prices has a role to play in that the prices of technology outputs tend to be falling. So even with increasing volume, sometimes they're not captured from a value point of view. It's important. And that if you take that into account, you wonder whether the reindustrialization trend that we are seeing is not even bigger from an activity point of view. That might be just that the price may be lower than we anticipate, and that is obvious in the case of the smartphone assembling in Africa, where we've seen significant trends in different countries. Ghana had RLG for many years and the rest, but the cost of these things are significantly lower than they were a few years ago if they had been manufactured in Africa. So that is important. The second preliminary point that I want to make is that one other thing that we've seen from the skills point of view is that increasingly informal educational networks are almost as important, if not more important, than formal educational systems. And what do I mean by that? A lot of on-the-job training is possible when you're talking about technologies like software development. So almost all the developers that I employ, software developers that I employ, I would say 95% of their skills were acquired within my company, not from university. And this is the case throughout the continent in terms of technology for auto mechanics, in terms of skills for auto mechanics, skills for plumbers. The vast majority of light industry, secondary level industrial activities, the skills compatibility dynamics there are entirely informal. So a lot of the discussions often around formal educational institutions like universities and the rest, but that is not how people are picking up these skills. So those are my two preliminary points, and then I'll answer your question about ecosystems. I have a view that rather than automation and some of these other trends that get a lot of attention, the most important of the mega trends in technology innovation is actually something I call hyper-integration. By which I mean that increasingly we are moving from just digital applications to platforms, but even more extreme, we are moving from platforms to something that the only name I can give them are hyper-integrals or hyper-lattices. And if you take your average successful technology platform today, and you say, okay, dial back to 15 years ago and how did it look like and how does it look like now? You'll be surprised in terms of the morphological changes. So in the past, and in the very recent past, most of these platforms really operated by being the behemoth at the center, and they had these monocentric integrations around them. So essentially, Facebook will integrate Instagram and all of these things orbiting around it, but generally controls the dynamics, and it imposes rules and norms on the whole network. Now, that is not the way it works. The way it works now is that if Google wants to go to the UK and revolutionize or disrupt the NHS, and so it sets up a partnership with the Royal Free Hospital, it no longer can play the platform game. It has to integrate almost on a uniform basis with the NHS. So those kinds of integrations, which I call polycentric integrations, where the rules are not made by one behemoth, but somehow have to be negotiated across lines of difference, are extremely powerful, and they're going to determine everything. If you take the aviation industry, where we're talking a lot about unmanned aerial applications, what a lot of people don't realize is that the only way for drones to become ubiquitous is for the National Airspace Administrations to open up so you can plug into them APIs that enable drone operators to somehow not fall afoul of regulation. At the same time, insurance companies that are insuring these drones need a direct connection as well, because the way that drone accidents work are different from the way car accidents work. Now, these integrations mean that you have a lot more heterogeneous connections, disparate connections that forces the platforms to change dramatically. It imposes a cost, because if you have a connection between the NHS and Google, the speed at which Google can release updates, the speed at which Google can release patches, can add new features is radically reduced. Secondly, your ability to innovate is also somewhat regulated. Now, this has added costs. So when you ask why is WeWorks not as profitable as Google was in 2007, why is all of this, even though they are all trying the same strategy of hyper-integration? The problem is that the new types of integrations don't allow them to accrete data using powerful algorithms in the way that they did. So now they need to integrate into disparate systems to preserve the same value. Now, if you take that and generalize it to Africa and you say, okay, is it possible now for a disruptive startup to build a new niche, which is the classical Christensen paradigm, build a new niche, serve customers that have less complicated needs, and then build capacity, and then over time try and supplant incumbents? The answer is no. Because right from the very outset, as we've seen with fintech startups in Africa, they have to integrate into banks. Then they have to integrate into national regulatory systems now. So now we have GovTech platforms that require that you plug into the central bank so they can better regulate you. They have to try and integrate into credit reference bureaus. And that is too much work for a startup. Mm-hmm. So my argument is that these hyper-integration trends make it extremely difficult for some of the disruptive innovations that enable upstarts to displace incumbents if possible.
So this is ironic coming from somebody who's actually set up a successful startup in Africa, but yeah, there we go. One last question for you all, sort of related to this. Again, are we asking the wrong? Are we worried about the wrong thing? There doesn't seem to be much of a sign of an industrial revolution in the economic statistics. We're seeing sluggish productivity growth in the United States. Actually, in manufacturing in the United States, outside of, you mentioned phone manufacturing, outside of electronics and IT, we're seeing sluggish productivity growth in manufacturing in the United States. We're seeing low job churn. We're seeing low unemployment. None of the sort of signs you'd expect to see of, fourth industrial revolution, here we are appearing. Is all of this a damp squib? And again, does it mean we're worrying about the wrong thing? We should be worrying about adoption, not about panicking. Worrying about the low rate of adoption, not panicking about the high rate of adoption.
I think if you had given Thomas Malthus great productivity statistics in 1800, his conclusion would not have been that much different because there wasn't anything to be seen. Steam engines weren't great at the time. They were not very energy efficient. Water power was more economical. And it took a while for steam engines to become sufficiently efficient to replace water power. And I think many of the technologies we're discussing today, like Amazon Go or driverless cars and so on, they haven't found widespread use yet. So we wouldn't expect them to be seen in the productivity statistics. And I think in addition to that, if you look at the industries that have adopted more robots more extensively, I think you do see the productivity gains from them, and work by Guy Michaels and Georg Gertz, I think, shows that quite pervasively.
But I wonder whether our ability to measure value again doesn't play a role here because of the way that value capture is changing. So if I think of the way in which Facebook, for instance, has to struggle in terms of the scale of activity and transactions on its platform before it can make a buck, what it has to do in terms of the activity before it can translate that in some kind of advertising dollars. I wonder if we really measure all that activity in all those hyper-integrals. So I'm concerned about this hyper-integration thing because I think people are not observing how the technology is actually being made. So we had a brilliant discussion yesterday about cybersecurity. And it was obvious to me from the trend of the discussion that most people don't realize that increasingly cybersecurity is not something you do within your four walls. Cybersecurity is actually now a matter of centralized databases and threat signatures and things like that. And it depends on how you are plugged into them. That determines whether you have a cybersecurity strategy or not. Now, how much of that value is leaked out of these hyper-integrals? Because it's very difficult to localize them and then measure them. So how much of these Uber network effects can properly be captured as value at one particular point and then applied in the productivity? So in that regard, I agree with Carl that productivity measurements are going to be even harder. The good thing, though, is that because of the same reason, those integrations also slow down the adoption of some of these automation technologies. A very simple example is the way that ERP implementations in Africa, which I have studied a little bit, have been extremely unsuccessful for most companies. I mean, globally, it's about 80% failure rate. But in Africa, it's even higher. So if you go to even the biggest companies and say, what has been your trend of ERP implementation? And ERP implementation is actually the best examples of automation we've had for decades because they've attempted to automate the enterprise all the way through the 60s to now has been ERP driven. Now the question is that why do ERPs fail? Because you have to integrate into disparate systems and disparate nodes and disparate points. And so my view is that those two trends set off each other.
Back to the political economy point. Sorry,
yeah, no, I think that, no, I think right, I mean, there is this sort of, certainly in the United States, but in a lot of other countries, this sort of productivity paradox, right? that you're presuming all these gains except in these numbers. And I do think your point that there's a lag between when some of this invention happens and when we actually find the sort of larger scale commercial value of some of this. So, so AI is a general purpose technology, but at the moment, it's still a little science fiction where the real changes may come, which doesn't mean they're not coming, but we're not necessarily picking it up. But I think pricing. So increasingly, services are a large, growing part of the economy, and they are really hard to measure productivity. What is exactly the output? What exactly are the inputs? There's so much intangible capital involved, and how do we actually measure that? And there's also enormous price markups, and how do you capture those? So there's enormous measurement challenges in how we capture that. So some of this is a mismeasurement question. And some of it, I think, it'll take time to really see how some of those changes would be. I also think, some of the dynamics that you're sort of raising too, that the economics and dynamics of some of these new sectors are different than the traditional ones. And how well we understand them and what some of their implications would be, we'll still tell as it plays out. And then the political economy, I mean, you think about, all these debates around privacy and what does that mean? And, I was reminded of that New Yorker cartoon, this was, 20 years ago, and of a dog on the internet saying, the internet's great because nobody knows you're a dog. And at this point, that's actually really not true. There is no anonymity not just on the internet, but with cameras, et cetera. It's not clear what anonymity we're going to have and what does that actually mean. I don't know. And how do we get comfortable with that? What kind of services are we going to have? What kind of political economy? What lines we want to draw? This is sort of uncharted. And some of the stories can be incredibly scary, some of the visions of what that might mean. And then others not. So I think it is sort of, that there's trouble potentially in the making, question mark there too.
I do actually want to open up soon, but let me just try and twist you a bit more positive. You keep on interjecting positive notes, for which thanks. Mary, you've talked about Ethiopia as a case where, actually manufacturing is doing quite well. Thank you very much. Maybe China isn't the last manufacturing miracle country. Would you go that far, or how positive are you on the Ethiopia story?
So I think it raises a lot of questions, actually. So, it's actually a country where, Chinese investment, including in the railway to some of the special economic zones, has been important. It has been a model that is very much driven by special economic zones and a lot of investment for which we don't necessarily know exactly the amount on the part of the government to create these zones and to attract the FDI. So the fact that they are exporting garments on one hand is good, but the ultimate cost benefit of that is unknown. So to me, that is actually a question mark. I think there's also a number of sort of flags to just raise around it. And I guess I'm coming at this because the number of conversations with other African countries that look at this and say, right, industrial policy, here we come. And as we know from East Asia, we know from a number of countries, there are ways where it can be done and be successful. We also know there are a large number of potentially well-intended, expensive failures. And we know a chunk of the reasons why they don't work, but that doesn't always mean it doesn't get tried again. So it's not the silver bullet. And so I have some things of caution. The other thing, if you sort of talk to some of the garment manufacturing companies, and it's not only garment, but that's at the moment one of their bigger sectors, the things they worry about are a lot of the traditional things. So one, exchange rate policy and being able to, they trade. They import most of their goods, they export it, and they have very limited controlled access to foreign exchange, which is a huge challenge for them. And the second is logistics, where you were mentioning logistics. And they compare the costs in Ethiopia vis-a-vis in Kenya. So wages are lower, but they're not incredibly low. And there's other studies that have sort of shown that if given really sort of the choice between given a certain amount of money to be an entrepreneur versus the wage, that in fact you can often do better being a self-employed entrepreneur. So it's not as if these are great wages being paid, but once you take into account logistics, it's not cost effective necessarily to be in Ethiopia, other than they're getting other fiscal incentives to really be there. So it's a model where they've been able to attract some companies. They're demonstrating it's possible. It still needs to reach the scale to really sort of take off. And they need to also have some more links between these zones and the rest of the economy. And at the moment, they're quite isolated. And so the sort of broader spillover benefits to date haven't quite happened. So I see some pieces of it that are a good story, but there's some caution, and there's some other, bread and butter traditional things that need to really happen for it to be an even rosier story. So the potential's there, but it's not the case that this is sort of the example I would trot to everyone else saying, please do this too.
Right, you've talked about Alibaba industrialization. I bet you're going to end up in the same place as Mary just did.
Well, I think that, so with the point around transnational elite networks being very critical, when you look at Chinese investment, you were asking me earlier about Chinese investment in Africa, it's okay, what did they invest in Ghana and why? They invested almost entirely in energy in the beginning, which is power plants. And most people don't realize it's just because there was a single Ghanaian who had been to Yale and met some Chinese, and then he traveled to Beijing and somehow brought the first set of investors. So that, I think, is also important from that point of view. Alibaba is interesting because it's enabling a lot of modular industrialization, where rather than people either come in and set up the factory, or people using manufacturers in China and then just adding the brand to it, they are important portable industrial lines, production lines. So these portable lines is enabling small batch manufacturing, which works very well for cities with a lot of affluent people around who want fresh processed food. Like I've seen the US granola, for instance. There's a lot of small batch granola manufacturing because that's how people want to eat their breakfast. And it's the same in Africa, where a lot of people want fresh food cooked, but you also want it semi-processed. And so that modular industrialization has been very, very powerful. The other thing that I've also observed as a mega trend is this situation where, because the boundaries of a lot of industries are dissolving, skills are highly transferable. So if you look at the medium and the lower segments, the same skill set that you need because of a lot of the supporting tools to be a nursing assistant is useful if you're in a telemarketing unit. Now, those type of situations of these cross-transferable skills across industries in the medium and lower segment, I think is going to be very powerful in places like Africa, where the education system is just not catching up.
And Carl, finally, to you, you've sort of we've had this discussion about how services may not be creating a lot of high productivity, low skill jobs. But you ended your blog for us on a sort of positive note about the multiplier effect of a few technology jobs. Say more.
Sure, yeah. So I think it's, broadly speaking, right that software production and biotech and these industries haven't created that many jobs directly, but they support a lot of in-person service type of jobs locally where those industries cluster. Enrico Moretti estimates that the multiplier of tech jobs in the US is around 5. We find that the multiplier is actually even a bit higher in many developing countries, because presumably, we don't know exactly why, but presumably because there's less use of labor-saving technology in the non-traded sector, and also because income disparities tend to be higher. And obviously the downside of working in some of these jobs is that they are quite technologically stagnant, so productivity is not that great, they don't pay very well. But we do actually know that people that work as waiters and receptionists and even as Uber drivers report higher subjective well-being than people that work in factories. So I think the non-monetary component of that is also something that should be taken into account.
I want to pick up on that. Sort of manufacturing jobs aren't great jobs. Working in a factory is pretty grim, and the only reason it's as good as it is in most countries is because of a lot of policy intervention, frankly. Can't the same apply to services? Services jobs don't need to be bad jobs, right? You can make them better, and indeed across countries they are better some places than others. In the United States, working in Walmart is worse than working in Walmart in France because of local policy conditions. Can't we just make services jobs better and solve the problem that way?
Well, I think labor unions have historically had a role to play in improving working conditions. I mean, a lot of it, in my view, has to do actually with technology, and I think factory electrification as such was one of the greatest improvements in working conditions that happened in the 20th century. But clearly unions have played a role in this, and there's, as you mentioned, significant differences in how comfortable different jobs are across country.
I mean, I think one of the differences why some of the manufacturing aren't is because you feel you're one more cog in the wheel, and the machine is sort of determining what needs to happen, and it's an incredible repetitive task, right? That's the sort of not good version, let alone safety concerns. So the thing about services is they tend to have more of a human interaction, and people like that, right? So in terms of having, so that could be a very good thing, right? Back to the sort of human welfare. That these are, and those are the things that are most hard to automate away, absolutely, right? So the more repetitive or sort of clerical kinds of jobs are more at risk of that. But the human interaction and the places where creativity matter, which are what tend to give people human satisfaction, are precisely what the machines are not good at yet. So that's a good thing.
I think when you look at industrial policymakers, though, and when they look at services, they still cannot take away their industry hats. So they look for things like business process outsourcing, and things like large-scale call centers, where they think because the jobs can be created in countable ways, and it makes it much easier to sell to the population. And I've seen that mean, therefore, that a lot of the service jobs that get outsourced into poor countries tend to be as bad as factory jobs.
Darn it. At which point, please, let's open it up to comments, questions.
Hi, well, thanks very much to Charles. Very good moderation to all of the panelists. Thank you very much. I'm Caroline Atkinson, a board member at CGD. I had a question that perhaps you want to take some others as well, because it's not really about technology, but to Mary about why is it, do you think, and maybe others have a view, that Bangladesh has not managed to raise standards? And of course, Bangladesh is a bit of a poster child for horrible factory conditions.
I think board members get their questions answered.
Do you want me to answer?
Immediately.
Collect.
Yeah.
Immediately. So Bangladesh has sort of I'm struck by your saying individuals make a difference, right? So Bangladesh getting into garments in the first place would fit beautifully in your framework, in that you had sort of Dash, right, and Daewoo. So you had a company in Korea making an investment and brought the workers from this one factory in Bangladesh, this is in 1994, to learn how to do this in Korea. They came back, and then the workers all left the company to start their own. And then you had this whole sort of proliferation. That's one version of the story. It's also true that there have been sort of particular reforms that were done in Bangladesh that have helped the cotton garment sector. So they've had bonded warehousing, and they've had these sort of chain letters of credit. So there was sort of that infrastructure assistance, and the access to finance was something that was solved or assisted, but also tariffs on cotton versus other kinds of fibers. And so that is part of it. So there's a broader set of issues as to how open and competitive some of these markets might be. Your point about the labor standards and the risks on the job, unfortunately, Bangladesh has had issues on that. There's been actually a lot of work, including from partnership with the ILO, the IFC, through Better Work and other partners to try and put that spotlight and to try and improve. So I think part of it is trying to figure out what are some of these other kinds of bottlenecks. What does it take for technology adoption? How much the other kinds of incentives in the country are actually working against some of the supposed interest in being able to get this diversification. So I think it does still come back to some of the bread and butter regulatory issues, who the incumbents are, the disruption that might come with some of these kinds of changes to really be able to get it. But I think there's other parts in that larger ecosystem too. Like, so things like e-commerce, being able to pay for things online. There are real restrictions in Bangladesh on credit card companies and who can offer the ability to pay for things online, which again puts a huge damper on being able to have some other kinds of new businesses coming in. So I think it needs to sort of take a wider sort of set of issues that may still need to be done to be able to broaden Bangladesh's opportunities.
It's often interesting that usually we think of institutions almost as if all of them are normative institutions, and we don't have technical institutions as well. And I found that for certain types of rights, technical institutions are more effective in regulating them than normative institutions. What do I mean by that? So if you take the human right, the vast spectrum of human rights, and you look at labor rights in particular, you may find that technical institutions like factory inspection units and the rest often have a more direct impact than these grand democratic institutions of courts and the rest, because people can assess them for these types of things. So I have often wondered in places like Ghana, which are very rich normative institutions, strong commission for human rights, etc. Why is it that factory jobs tend to be so bad and mining jobs tend to be so bad? And it turns out that if your technical institutions in places like China, where we are seeing an increasing improvement in factory regulation because the technical institutions are strong, some of the rights like labor and civic that don't threaten governments tend to be quite well enforced. So that would be my take.
I don't know about the Bangladesh example in particular, but I think classical determinants would be how much surplus labor do you have, what are people's outside options in the places they live, how mobile is labor geographically and across occupations. So I think those are all factors that determine people's bargaining power more broadly.
Everything is loyalty, voice, and exit. Fair enough.
I'm from Chile. I have an investment company there. Hi, I'm from Chile. And every time I come to Washington, I come to these nice presentations because they are so pellucidly clear. They paint a picture about how the world is and all that. And it becomes clear to me. But then I ask myself, how does it relate to what I see? And there is a gap. The gap is, I think, that all the countries in the world are exactly the same. They're all different from each other. And unless you address, and unless you have some creative ad hocism, it's very difficult to develop. In the case of Chile, we opened up the country for investments, created rules that were very attractive for mining companies to come, water companies to come, utilities to come. They came, invested big time. And now, in the last 10 years, Chilean companies started to get all the know-how and buy them out. In fact, they are even starting to invest in Argentina, Brazil, Peru, even in the United States. Not only that, I'm looking at what is happening over the last, say, 5-10 years. Many of the local companies, very local, very small, are starting to work with mining companies in order to see how could they build alliances, adjust interests in a common way between them so that the companies not only buy from Chilean companies in terms of engineering, geological work, etc., but do so worldwide. Because we have the who is who of mining companies in Chile, why not serve those mining companies worldwide? And this is building a common interest to raise the standards of such technical people in the country in order to elect. The simple question I have is it possible that the world is absent of all this broad logic that you're talking about, and that really, in today's world, it's the diversity, it's the alignment of interest, it's the branding, it's the bringing together parties so that they form real alliances so that they can grow together. Is that perhaps the only logic that there is around to really develop in today's world?
Fascinating. I'm going to take a few in the interest of time. So can we go there and then?
Yeah, Thomas Wehrmann from the IFC. I have one question regarding the relationship in service and manufacturing. One of the items is maintenance, which is maybe could be mentioned perhaps more about, because in Germany, where I come from, service jobs in maintenance are often 6-digit jobs in euros for people who have not studied at university. They maintain this multi-million-dollar equipment, which is dominant, which is dependent on actual manufacturing. Many of the socialist countries, also in Africa or Vietnam, have these cadres who have a history of being enamored with production. Communism was about production. The East Germans were production. There is a notable, unnecessary, unforced error in many of this former Second World, which we almost never called Second World, but has been Second World. The overlook of services, retail, was dismally bad in East Germany. Service was overlooked in all these cadre economies. So what would that mean for all these stars like Ethiopia or Vietnam who have this communist past, have this cadres of guys who know to run big things, and yet have this intellectual whole of services? M-Pesa is Kenya, which has not been a socialist country. So what do we make out of that glaring gap that even has repercussions today?
Thank you. One more, and then and then next time.
Thank you. My name is Sufyan Ahmed. I'm a former Minister of Finance of Ethiopia. Just to make Ethiopia, former Finance Minister of Ethiopia. Yes, when I was a finance minister a few years ago, I was a finance minister for really quite a long time, if I say. As you know, Ethiopia has huge populations. The youth are growing at an alarming rate. Still, our economy is predominantly agriculture. 40% of the economy is agriculture. 45% is service sector. It's only 5 sector proper manufacturing. So we identified that if we focus on the labor-intensive manufacturing that requires low skill, probably over years we can move the use from agriculture to manufacturing. As a result, we have been investing in education, in infrastructure, Mary, as you said, in industrial parks. But those who are investing in manufacturing sector are the private sector. And lately, the data show that they are interested. They are not only Chinese, they are Turkish, they are from other countries. Mm-hmm. If, as you said, really it's not words, why do they invest? As I know, probably as you know, the labor is comparatively cheap. The availability, the electricity is also relatively affordable. Yes, logistic is very difficult. Yet the private sector, they do their own analysis and they invest in those industrial parks. Why do they invest if it is not really cost effective?
Thank you. Let's take those three. We had a question about ad hocism, which actually links back, I think, nicely to the many examples you've already come up with of sort of where personal sort of random relationships really matter to outcomes. This is the kind of thing when it's hard to come up with a policy for how you make random connections happen. So are there general rules, or is it going to be so very context specific? We had the question that, if I may summarize as, can ex-communists do services, and is that a problem? And then from the minister, why are companies investing if logistics is such a challenge? I want to add a little bit to that one. I don't know the statistic for Ethiopia, but if you look at Kenya's population and the average years of education in Kenya's population, it's the same as it was in France in 1970. The education is much more widespread in the developing world than it was in rich countries at a similar level of income. Doesn't that give you a hope and optimism that there's the workforce out there to do these more skilled jobs, and that actually that won't be a big barrier to Ethiopia, other countries in Africa, sort of climbing up the chain to these slightly more complex jobs? Take out of them which you will.
Well, maybe stating the obvious with regard to the first question, but obviously, the more social exclusion you have in a society, the less interaction you will have, the less recombinant innovation you will have, the less development you will have. So I think, I mean, it's simply, you know, a question of making sure that, you know, people have access to education, and, you know, you don't have obscene zoning restrictions, so people can live in more, you know, diverse communities, and so on and so forth. So I think that's probably part of the story.
I think for the Chilean situation, you made a very interesting point about service providers in Chile, then saying that if we can service a multinational company in one country, why not, you know, the rest? I mean, I find that fascinating, because in my own business, we started in very specific countries, but then we had multinational customers. So we had Hoffmann La Roche, we have Sanofi, and in the case of Sanofi, it's very interesting how using the Sanofi platform, we internationalized from one African country, Nigeria, to eventually Egypt, India through them, and South Africa. So there is that dynamic. I wonder though whether in that kind of scenario, there is some, you know, because I experienced a trust barrier. So I had to come to France a lot to sit down with these executives and kind of convince them that they could trust an African company, to take them from Ghana to Morocco and Egypt. And the point was, if I wanted to do that, why would the Ghanaian company be the best? In this case, what worked though was that we had local innovations that they hadn't seen in other markets. And so I guess they didn't have as much of a broad field to choose from. So in terms of a general theory, I don't have a general theory yet, but I think trust is a very critical element of how these internationalization effects might play out. Can you build trust enough in one location and then use that as the springboard or the launch pad to spread out? But I know it doesn't do justice to your very fascinating question.
So I have a couple of different answers. So, you know, the real world and sort of economics within it is not like physics. So I don't think the sort of laws of economics are like the laws of physics, and you can take a closed system and tell you exactly what's going to happen, even if there's some difficulties in the physics on that. The world is complex, and that's sort of what's interesting. So it's not that there are no rules and no predictions, because there are insights from this, but the systems are really complex. And so being able to say, we shouldn't have the audacity to say we can determine the systems and outcomes. And there is diversity in all kinds of dimensions across countries, and that's part of the insight and benefits, and why there can be opportunities in different locations is precisely to take advantage of that diversity and use that as a strength. Okay, I'm going to not answer on the communist part per se, but to me, the piece that's really important in that is that link between manufacturing and services is actually important. So there can be value in services themselves, but I think one of the increasing trends is the sort of blurring lines between manufacturing and services. In part, services are what help differentiate different manufactured goods. They're hugely important inputs, from the R&D to being able to have this sort of aftercare and maintenance that came up otherwise, right? But it's, so I think those are an increasingly important part for manufacturing itself. So I think, to me, one of the other sort of conversations, coming back somewhat the example also in Ethiopia, is, do you actually need to manufacturing on its own? That, to me, is another piece of it. So just looking at the manufacturing, I think, is a mistake, because where the real value added often comes in, including in manufacturing, is precisely the services. And so, Minister, I think you bring a really important point, which is the private sector investment. And that is going to go to a really critical test of whether the investors think this is worthwhile. And they are going to vote with their money, right? And so they are coming is a testament from their perspective of whether or not this is something that is viable. You know, and the country has invested in providing some of that input, whether through the zones, facilitating some of the land, some of the infrastructure connections, et cetera, to help on making that case. But I think in making that, the other piece, which I should have also mentioned, is it's not just sort of a static game here. I mean, one of the questions, which is a dynamic one, and so it's not just, can Ethiopia get its foot in the door in garments today, which it is doing, is what are the learning opportunities? What does this mean for demonstration effects? What kind of logistical solutions will they come up with that is not just going to help the firms that are in these zones now, but that give Ethiopian firms a foot in the door on how supply chains work, where there are new opportunities, et cetera. So, this is, to me, the bigger bet that Ethiopia is making, is it's, so even if they're sort of helping subsidize through the zones some of the initial entry, private sector is responding, and the big question is whether they can turn this into the dynamic gains, and how important that is to sort of get your foot in the door, to be able to have a ladder to climb. So I think that actually is that's to me, the bigger underlying question. But it matters that it's then followed up with the kinds of things that enable that dynamism to happen. And so there's still some bottlenecks that are, the agenda is never over. So the starting is there, and that's sort of the next big question is how to keep that going so that you get the longer virtuous cycle over time.
The agenda is never over. This event is in about 10 minutes. So I want to, gosh, right. Can we go boom, 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 boom? Starting over here.
Very much for this very stimulating discussion. A quick comment and then a question for everyone. The quick comment is about China. On China, I think it's useful to keep in mind that China is not a monolith. And so this model of rapid growth through export-led manufacturing is overwhelmingly concentrated on the coast. Yeah. So 5 coastal provinces account for 76% of China's exports. And so vast parts of China have in fact missed the manufacturing boat, and they're now pummeled by the trade war. And so they're actually desperately trying to leapfrog into services and big data. So I think just subnational variation is useful to keep in mind. And then the question for the panel, Bright, I love your insights about sequence, about networks, about ecosystems, which really inspires the question of what do you think should be the role of government, or can be the role of government? Should they, stay out of the picture and let the private sector figure it out? Or is that some critical role that the government has to step in and perform? Would love to hear that. Thank you.
The pessimism that you expressed about labor-intensive export-led industrialization, there is a reaction to that in developing countries. And now there's a clamor for industrial policy that tries to skip that stage and focus on slightly more technologically sophisticated products. My question to you is, you gave some examples from how Ghana is networking with others, but are there enough examples from other parts of the world where this has been done successfully, either now or historically, where countries can jump to more sophisticated products by giving enough policy attention in those areas, and somehow avoid the increasingly pessimistic view of labor-intensive exports?
Thanks on that. Thanks for your presentation. It's very good. Let me build on the last questions. Given what we've seen, my friend Miguel says, every country is different, but we have seen that what used to be the East Asian miracle is now essentially the East and South Asian miracle. We've had problems in Bangladesh and standards, enormous growth in jobs in export. So what are the alternatives if you can't do that? And could someone pick up on the question that Charles raised about the importance of education? And I'd add into that, Mary, you talked about, you don't need to read to drive. I would say that it would be hard to find a country that has done well in rapid growth in employment where education has not been widespread. And let's not forget the importance of psychosocial skills as well as the STEM kinds of things, or even literacy applied directly. So could someone say something about education? Thanks.
Back there and then over here. We're going to call it quits at that.
Thank you. So I just wanted to pick up on Mary's point about the importance of private sector investment, and I'm working on a program that facilitates small business backwards linkages between SEZs and small businesses, and I'm wondering if the panel could speak to opportunities for SMEs and small business to really participate in the productivity gains from technology.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. You pointed out in your introduction, I think correctly, that export-led growth has been a tremendous success in the past and abolished poverty at a large scale all over the world. Now, that is true for some countries, but not for others. And so my question is, what are the key criteria that allow countries to succeed in export-led development that have to be fulfilled for countries to make that success? And secondly, are these criteria still relevant in today's world with the new technology and with increasing nationalism that closes previously open borders? So is it still worthwhile for countries that have so far not succeeded to look what is necessary to succeed in export-led development?
Thank you. That was fantastic. Partially, I did a very bad job as a moderator in pushing towards policy proposals, and you all have corrected that. I think sort of three questions were basically around, what role is there for government in network creation? What are the policies needed? Do we know the policies needed to do sort of leapfrogging from over low skill to more advanced manufacturing, and sort of, what are the key criteria that separated those countries that have managed to do the export-led growth model from other countries, and would the same policies work again today, if you will? Then we had related questions on, what opportunities are there for SMEs, and sort of what about education? Please answer those questions and conclude your thoughts all in the same go, in whichever order you would like. Who's going first? Oh, come on.
It's a lot of things. Okay, so role for government. I'd say sort of 2.5 things. So one is the enabling environment, right? So, the talk of the investment climate, getting in infrastructure. The list is long. It's the usual thing. We also know it doesn't have to have all of it be perfect. Countries are able to make progress without sort of things all being perfect. The other sort of role, however, I was going to say is potentially sort of more of a coordination. So particularly where some pieces don't work, there may need to be, or you can't roll it out sort of, particularly say on infrastructure, to the whole country at once, coming up with some solutions in some particular places, right? So this is why, zones, say in Ethiopia, are able to get some manufacturing in some places. But so essentially it's providing public goods, right? That's the traditional role for what the government should be doing. However, it should not be that private sector is sitting around waiting for the public sector to do it all before they necessarily come in. And so there can be successful cases where there's a business model and private sector can come in. Or they can be helpful in sort of saying, hey, look, we might be increasing investment and hiring if you could solve these different kinds of problems, which is why there's dialogue between the public sector and the private sector. And sometimes that needs a little facilitation, not necessarily. But I think there's, that's sort of a basic sort of recipe, but I think that's still an important one. The point about unevenness across countries is absolutely true. You look at the moment, the countries that are having the biggest difficulty, and the thing that stands out is conflict, right? So you're not going to invest and put your factories or be hiring lots of people when there's that level of insecurity. So that's sort of a huge issue, big development challenge, is really trying to wrestle with a very difficult political economy questions on fragility and conflict. So that certainly is one. I think exchange rates is still sort of another. It's very difficult to be competitive if your exchange rate is very misaligned. So this can be particularly challenging for some of the natural resource countries. So those are probably the second block of countries, at least in this sort of manufacturing service-led growth, where there's been challenges with some of the diversification. And then otherwise, it's the sort of the investment climate, but I think the skills is another really important point. If you look at what happened certainly in the first round of sort of East Asian Miracle, there had been huge investment in human capital and education in terms of really preparing a workforce that was going to be able to be productive on the job. And I do think this is actually one of the sort of success stories in some sense of development is, there's intrinsic as well as sort of instrumental value to education, right? And I think we all think both those pieces matter. So I think it is important to educate people. I wasn't trying to say it doesn't matter. I'm just trying to say that technology can be helping even where there are gaps, right? And because the other thing is it's young people that get educated, and you have older people in the workforce who may not 40 years ago have had the same educational opportunities that young people do now. And they still need access to be able to use some of this technology or get some of the benefits. And so the fact that technology usage can be not as demanding on skills is a good thing. So take it more that way. And then just sort of lastly, the sort of entrepreneurship and SMEs and how there can be inclusive growth. I mean, to me, there's been, and again, the WDR this year is really emphasizing these sort of global value chains and getting plugged into bigger markets. And this sort of goes back to your export. I mean, it may be export, it may be even national, but it's, again, accessing to markets is really critical. And some of the technologies make this easier. I think there's still questions out about how the algorithms work on some of these e-commerce, whether that really happens. But there is at least the potential to find niche markets at a bit more scale, to build some reputation, to have some of the facility to get the payments and some of the logistics to make it possible. So the ingredients are all there that could be really encouraging. We still need to watch that space to see how much it happens in practice. But and the fact that a lot of them have more service intensity, they're less capital intensive, should also help lower some of the barriers to entry. You don't need to have accumulated the same amount of capital to be able to enter. So, and that, I think there is some sunshine. But we have to sort of watch to make sure the rules of the game really allow that to happen in practice.
Quick final flashes of sunshine?
Yeah, I have 4 quick points. I'm trying to summarize and address all the issues that have been raised. So I'll go point by point. Education, I think we don't often pay attention to how industry-led educational systems can be effective. Look at accounting. Almost the entirety of accounting is led by professional accounting bodies and certification agencies and the rest of it. And most of the people that I know that are the best accountants in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and the rest are SCCA certified, and the rest, very few of them actually have degrees in accounting. And much of that is driven by industry. So the notion that we have to have a national educational system as the only way to deliver education into this world, I don't think is viable. And I think we have evidence from accounting and specific segments like that industry-led educational models can be very viable. On small business entities, I'll give one caution as opposed to address the whole point. And that is that in most parts of the world, there's this view that the Silicon Valley new venture model driven by venture capital is somehow potentially importable. So you have all these incubators and accelerators, and nothing could be further from the truth. A lot of it is actually patent nonsense. The amount of failure rates of these type of startups is so high that unless you're going to put billions of dollars into them, the possibility that they're going to generate jobs is very limited. So we're going to have to create more working capital mechanisms and other ways of financing slower growth startups with higher chance of success. These startups that start with a 90% chance of failure, but if they succeed, they make 100x, and that 100x pays for everything. It's just not applicable to most part of the world. But a lot of small business policy is now being driven by this Silicon Valleyization of enterprise development. It's very dangerous. On the issue of what government can do, I will start off by reiterating the point about transnational elite networks, because I believe that in a lot of the questions that came up, they were very pertinent. So the question from former finance minister around how is it that some of these industrial parks are working, whether it's Hawassa or some of the new ones, if you go deep into the ethnography of these developments, you'll be surprised to learn how specific consulting companies, specific individuals who know people in China almost entirely drive everything. To give you an example, Ethiopian Airlines' amazing success, incredible success, Ethiopian Airlines. One of the few logistics success stories we have, cross-continental. Most people don't realize the history and evolution of Ethiopian Airlines as the predominant player on the continent. recently, the attempt by countries to use Ethiopia Airlines as kind of like a national airline in a box model. So they come to your country and you call it a national airline, but it's run on Ethiopia Airlines platform. The person that developed it is a gentleman called Zed Ligatu, and it's almost all the thinking was from an Ernst & Young office in Addis Ababa. And yet still, when you look at the success and you look at it blossoming, you almost never dig beneath. So I think trans-elite national networks are powerful. Look at the Indian software outsourcing model.
Not at any length.
Okay. Nilikani and Premji, Wipro and Infosys. You can literally point to specific individuals and specific networks and how that happened. Last point about government. So what then is the role of government? I think that because transnational elite networks are so powerful, my view is that the government's role is to identify flagships and build a reputational capital that makes it likely that these will not fail, and then trigger on successive investments. Because if the flagships fail, almost inevitably, the successive waves of investment will not come.
The last word is yours, Carl.
Just very quickly, so I think we have a fairly good idea what the key criteria for successful development are, and secure property rights, political stability, extension of the franchise, deep markets. And the question is then obviously why don't every country adopt that? And I think the reason for that is that those are associated with very long-term gains, but the short-term implications of structural change aren't very appealing to every country in every time and place. And even in Sweden, where I come from, there was a big debate in the late 19th century whether Sweden should even industrialize, because the conditions in the Manchester factories were so appalling, and people didn't believe for a second that that would be an election winner. But I think growing competition sort of more or less made it inevitable in Europe. And I think there's often, as competition intensifies, people are sort of, forced to industrialize, not to fall behind as a result of, competition between countries. At least in the 19th century, I think that was the case. So yeah, I think that's my, at least, take on the economic history of it.
Thank you very much, everybody. I will not try to summarize in the interest of time, but I thought that was a fascinating conversation. Thank you for your interventions. Please stay around. There is lunch. There is Jason Furman. There is a fascinating panel on tech governance to come. But thank you for your time.
Okay, we're ready for you. Okay, thanks. So hello, everybody. Thanks very much, and thanks to those of you who also attended the session this morning, which was really terrific and very nicely moderated by Charles. I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Jason Furman, and whom I've known for probably longer than either of us would want to admit, but since the days of the Clinton administration. And one of the fabulous things about Jason is that he is a brilliant economist, tremendous researcher, and also a master of public policy. And I think it's quite unusual there are some obviously great people in the US who combine those talents, and Jason is certainly one of them. And he is also what I worked with Jason or alongside Jason when he was in the Obama administration. And I'll get to his more formal bio for a moment in a minute. But one of the things that was very true then was that whenever there was an important issue, Jason would be analyzing and bringing forward and doing good research work on what were the economics of that issue and how did that translate into what should be done for public policy. And so we are really lucky to have him here to talk to us about technology. And you might think, well, this guy who's done all this work on fiscal policy and macro and all the rest of it, what on earth does he know about technology? And being Jason, he's learned all about technology and has a lot to teach the rest of us and many people who know about technology as well. So I asked him for his bio. It's incredibly long, of course, but I'm just going to give you the highlights now. He's a professor of the practice of economic policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And he currently chairs the Digital Competition Expert Panel of the UK, which I was interested. I didn't know that the panel still had a life. He was the 28th chairman of the Council on Economic Advisors at for the last several years of his 8 years with President Obama in the White House. And please join me in welcoming Jason Furman.
I don't need that, right, of course. Great. Thank you, Caroline, for that great introduction. Thanks for having me here at the Center for Global Development. I actually worked at the World Bank for 1.5 years. Oh, some colleagues. But here I'm going to talk to you more about technology in an advanced economy context. I think a lot of what I'm saying translates. Some of what I'm saying doesn't translate. And you all would be better judges about what does or doesn't. I'm also going to focus my remarks on technology, employment, and the future of work. But Caroline made the mistake. I sent you an outdated bio, so I will correct the bio and invite you to ask me a question when we have time for that on a completely different topic, which was up until March, I was chairing a panel for the UK government, expert panel, on digital competition. We came out with a report on how to promote competition in the digital sector. And one of the recommendations was to establish a regulatory authority, the Digital Markets Unit, and the government announced that they're establishing that. They're moving forward in their work on it, and I'm now actually formally advising them on that. So I have a new hat continuing the project. So if people want to talk about digital competition, would love to do that. I just couldn't quite figure out how it linked to work. So there are, I've been to about 80 salon dinners to discuss the future of work. And even more lunches. And, there's this real desire to get ahead of whatever the problem we're facing is. And to get ahead of whatever the problem we're facing is, we need to figure out, what's going to happen in the future. And that's a really hard thing to do. A lot of the debate boils down to, will the future look like the past, or will the future be different than the past? And the people who think it will look like the past find that sentiment very reassuring. We managed the transition from agriculture to manufacturing, going from 70% of our population in agriculture to 2%. We managed the transition from manufacturing to services. We'll be able to manage this next transition too. And there's a set of economic arguments, a lot of which have a lot of truth, that new technologies create new types of jobs. They create more demands for old types of jobs. We have more masseuses today than we had 50 years ago, and a whole lot more people in the leisure and hospitality, retail industries. And that in general there's a reason to sort of think the unemployment rate stays the same over long periods of time. So that's the comforting story some tell. Future's just like the past. The past was fine, so the future will be fine, so you don't need to worry. That would be story one. Story two is the future is going to be really different than the past. The robots are about to come. The robots are about to take all of our jobs. Sure, in the past, we always invented new types of jobs. Sure, in the past, we always were richer, and that created more demand for old types of jobs. But this time it's going to be really different. And this time it's going to happen too quickly. The robots will be able to serve food in the restaurant, so you won't get any more of those jobs. The robots will be able to replace some of the higher order cognitive tasks, and I'm using robots quite loosely for all automation. And so the future is going to be very different than the past. Now the future is very different from the past. People split into two groups. One is the sort of apocalyptic types who think there'll be sort of a robot overlord, or maybe some small group of people that own the capital stock that profit from all the robots and everyone else will suffer. And the sort of utopian, we're all going to be really happy, relaxed, and don't need to worry anymore because somebody else will be doing all of the unpleasant work. Now, where do I situate myself between these two, and what are its implications for policy? I'm a little bit more in the former, future, a continuation of the past, and I find that possibility quite scary, because I think in many ways we did manage the past badly, and we did bigger things in the past than we're doing in the future. So let me talk about both halves of that. If you want to look at employment rates and try to understand why they vary a lot across countries, you'd see Iceland has a much higher employment rate than Italy does. Or Switzerland has a much higher employment rate than Spain does. No one would look at those differences and, if you were sort of assigned a paper, and your paper was go figure out why employment is higher in Iceland and Switzerland than it is in Italy and Spain, you would go through a lot of different explanations, and you probably wouldn't give a moment's thought to which country has more or less automation. You'd ask, what are the rules on hiring and firing? What are the ways people search for jobs? What's the minimum wage? You'd ask all sorts of questions, but you wouldn't ask that. So there's enormous variation already between countries that is a function not of the degree of automation, but of their labor market institutions and how their labor market institutions do and don't prepare people for jobs, connect people with jobs, help people stay in jobs, and when their jobs change, help them transition flexibly to the next job. You see the same enormous differences within countries. If you look at the level of employment in the United States, for example, men work more than women. People in middle age work more than older and younger workers. And those patterns have evolved over time. The difference between men and women has narrowed a lot over the last 50 years, as women's participation in the workforce has increased, and men's participation in the workforce has continued to decline. In fact, even today, in the historically low unemployment, a record streak of job creation, the longest economic expansion we've ever had in the United States, prime age men between 25 and 54, are employed at a lower rate than they were employed in 2007 before the recession. So for them, the economy hasn't recovered. They're still in recession compared to where they were before it. So that's another type of fact that is not about technology per se, the differential trends between men and women, but about a set of cultural, institutional, and other changes. It's not just employment rates, but part of the positive story of the robots haven't taken all the jobs to date is also because wages adjust. And the flip side of a lot of the automation has been rising inequality. So, if you can't, compete with a robot at $20 an hour, maybe you can compete with a robot and get hired at $12 an hour. So if you look at the way we've coped with the changes in technology in the past, we've coped with them in part by allowing inequality to go up, and in part by allowing employment rates to go down. And if you look across countries, there's tremendous heterogeneity in the degree to which one or both of those have happened. And if economics was exactly right, they should have moved in opposite directions. Countries that had a big increase in inequality should have been the ones with labor markets that cleared and did well on the employment side. And vice versa. If you tried to stifle the increase in inequality with too many labor unions, too high a minimum wage, then you'd stifle the increase in inequality, but you'd end up with a dysfunctional labor market and high levels of employment. That's not how it's worked out, actually. The United States has ended up with bigger increase in inequality, sort of that part of the bargain that we struck here in the United States of willingness to accept inequality we got, but we didn't get it with higher employment rates. In fact, we got it with, for age 25 to 54 at least, lower employment rates than are currently enjoyed in most European countries, for example. So we have this past where you have the heterogeneity of experiences on employment, heterogeneity of experiences on inequality. And what that tells you is the technology shock is really important. It's really worth thinking about, how computers change things, how artificial intelligence and machine learning is going to change things in the future, what jobs are at risk, what jobs aren't at risk. But even more important than that is not the technological determinism that comes out of that, but how your institutions and your society processes it. And whether you prepare your workers for those changes, whether you have labor market institutions to cope with them, or whether you don't. So that's why the experience of the recent past shouldn't be fully comforting to us. And if that experience continues going forward, it's a challenge. How have we met that challenge in the past? We've all heard the sort of fairy tale of the agricultural to manufacturing transition. At the same time that the economy was transitioning from agriculture to manufacturing, across all of the advanced economies, high schools became free, universal, and in many cases, mandatory. It was a massive change in the way we prepared people for a new workforce, giving people a set of skills and ability to adapt that they didn't have when the main thing they did was working on farms. What's the equivalent of that type of major effort today to help enable the transition? I think partly a lot of the answer doesn't come from formulating policy based on the future of work. All of those lunches, dinners, etc. I've been to, I want to scream out, don't make policy for the future of work. Make policy for the recent past of work. If we knew exactly what things were going to be like 10 or 20 years from now, maybe we could make policy for them. But first of all, we don't. Second of all, things change a bit more slowly than we all like to think. And in fact, right now, the surprise is productivity growth is low. We're replacing fewer people than we thought we would. We're creating a lot of jobs, but not creating a lot of GDP, which is the opposite of what you should have in the automation type of story. So it's really hard to predict where we're going to be. Changes are often slower than what you think. And there was a Nobel Prize awarded earlier this week for work on randomized control trials. You can't do a randomized control trial on the future. If you want to have your programs be based on sound evaluation and rigorous do they work and do they not work, you can only use that data from the recent past or the distant past for that. So I think to a first approximation, if we got our labor market institutions and policies right for what would have worked really well and had them perfect for the last 10 years, they'd be 90% correct for 15 years from now. And I'm not saying it's a constant process of adaptation, learning, and change. I'm not saying just do something and forget about it. So if we got it perfect for the recent past, I think we'd be in pretty good shape for the future. If we want to take a wild guess at the future, I think there's a decent chance we'll be a lot worse than 90% right. We could be 50% right or 10% right. I personally think ideas like UBI, for example, are premised on a misdiagnosis about the future and a sort of misunderstanding of what you want to do to cope with the future. It's giving up on jobs rather than asking what can we do to help people get jobs and equip them to succeed in their jobs. Now, I wouldn't ignore the future entirely. You want to ask, are ratios of different parts of the issue going to be different in the future than they've been in the past? We did an exercise at the Council of Economic Advisors where we took Carl Frey's numbers, 47% of jobs at risk of automation, and asked, where are these in the wage distribution? And the results were really stunning. Below $12 an hour, it was something like 80% of jobs were at risk. Above $24 an hour, or $40 an hour, very, very few jobs were at risk, and in between, the number was in the 30s. The OECD has done something similar with a different list of jobs that are at risk, but they find it much more heavily correlated with education. If you have a graduate degree, you don't need to worry at all. If you have a high school degree or less, you are precisely the person who over the last several decades has been most likely to see your employment decline and your wages go down, and you are the one most at risk. There's the examples of the radiologists that people give for the high skilled that's at risk. At 80 of these dinners I've gone to over the span of many years, that's the example people use. And so if they had a second example, I'd find the argument more compelling. If employment by radiologists had fallen, I'd find it more compelling. And if you looked at what radiologists do and noticed that they benefit a lot from the ability to have a combined diagnosis of machine and human, and over the course of their day, they don't just stare at something and try to figure out, is it cancer or not? They interact with each other, they interact with patients, they do all sorts of things, of which one part is partly automatable, not even fully automatable. So, I think we need to worry across the skill distribution to some degree, but I think most of what we need to worry about, most of what we know, is the same thing we should have been worried about more in the recent past is likely to be the problem we continue to face in the future. So what does that mean? Some of the things that come out of this are quite generic. Education is one of the most things that can prepare people to be the most flexible over the course of their careers and adaptable and have higher wages. In different countries, the priorities are going to be different. In the United States, preschool 3 to 4 has enormous returns and is really underinvested in, and then expanding at the other end in terms of college, improving educational systems and the like. I think some of the fact that inequality and lack of employment have moved together with each other rather than in opposite directions challenges us to think that it's not just making labor markets as flexible as possible. It's not just the traditional sort of old school OECD, structural reform agenda, but you need something of whether it's apprenticeships or vocational training, lifelong training, labor unions that connect people to jobs. Some of those are institutions that evolve over time. Some of those are, the government needs to come in and figure out and create them. And I think our understanding of all of that is weaker than it should be. And then last, I wouldn't start by giving up on jobs, but some of the increase in inequality may be inevitable. And so cushioning the blow of that increase in inequality with support for work. Things like the Earned Income Tax Credit and other ways of subsidizing work are a win-win way to say you're going to have a job, you're going to be paid better in your job, and we're going to encourage you to participate in the workforce. And building more of a division in our social safety net between a basic bedrock, you don't want people to starve, you want to have something for everyone, you want to have some things related to children in the family, for example, like child allowance, but then have a part of it that is explicitly designed and targeted to encourage and support work. So, there's a lot of other things on the list, but I think those are some of the biggest, which is, what you can do with your educational system, what you can do with your institutions to connect people with jobs, what you can do to reward work. I talked, to conclude, I talked about some of the heterogeneity, we've seen within the United States between different genders, different ages, different periods of time. Some of the heterogeneity across advanced economies. I have no doubt that those of you that look at developing economies see even more heterogeneity than what I just talked about. There's a whole discussion around premature industrialization and the like. That's certainly a challenge, but we should be able to turn that into a high-class problem, not a reason to sort of set oneself on fire with despair, but light a fire to make sure that we're acting to take advantage of it. Certainly when I look at the United States, I don't celebrate the fact that productivity growth is low, because that means we can have high levels of employment. I lament that fact. Premature industrialization is a way of saying productivity is higher at this stage than it would have been in the past. It's a big challenge that one needs to rise to. My guess is that there's a lot to learn from, and a lot of you know vast amounts about. Rather than treating it as a uniform issue, look country by country to understand what works, what doesn't, and how to take advantage of this opportunity rather than give into it. Thank you. So I think there's time for like 2 or so questions. Okay, Charles definitely gets one. You could do 4 also.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I want to push you even further towards technology doesn't matter to this story. You've been having a Twitter discussion this week about whether the US tax system is progressive or not. Long and the short of it, yes, but I think you'd agree it's less progressive than it used to be. We also have a lot less union power than we used to. If you look at when productivity and wages started splitting apart, it was the 1970s. It's got nothing to do with robots today. Why do you need to mention technology at all when it comes to the story of increased inequality in the United States?
Productivity's gone used to go like this, now it's going like this. I'll do that so everyone see. It used to be rising rapidly, now it's not rising as rapidly. And you see when it was rising rapidly, wages rose with it. Now it's not rising as rapidly and wages are below it. So if you decompose the two of those, the slowdown in median household income is partly due to the rise in inequality, but it's also due to the slowdown in technological progress. If we have ideas that operate on both of those margins simultaneously, education operates on both of those simultaneously. I actually think more competition operates on both of those simultaneously. The lack of competition in the economy, or reduction in competition, has hurt inequality and hurt innovation. So I think if you have things that work on both those margins, that's great. But if you can't work on both those margins, often we have quantitatively larger tools in advanced economies on the distributional side. I think for a developing economy, the difference between growing at 3% a year and 8% a year is just massive and swamps everything else. For us, if you look at the economic debates, they're about the difference between growing at 1.8 and 2.0, and that just doesn't swamp everything else to the same degree. So I think the sort of relative ratio that you want to care about distribution and growth, if you have decent policies and you're near the growth frontier, as all the advanced economies are, you want to do better, but there's not much of a margin to do better. I think in the developing world, there's way more variance, and so the growth side probably does matter a little bit higher in terms of the ratio. Yeah.
Thank you. The question I have is with regard to technology policy. To what extent is it possible for the
government and so on to bias technology development so as to make it less labor displacing? This has come up in the past. Is there an answer to that, or is it beyond the control of the government or any kind of policy making to bias technology development?
Right. I would have said that was a completely crazy idea, except Tony Atkinson devoted a bunch of his last book on inequality to that idea. And so now I think it's an idea that's way beyond me intellectually, but you know, I don't know how you do it. I really don't know how you judge. You know, we fund the NSF. A lot of what we fund is very, very basic stuff. You don't quite know which way it's going to bounce. When you're developing the internet, you know, is that going to replace labor or complement labor, and who's going to do what? So I think it's a lot easier to prepare people for whatever comes, help insulate the downside of whatever comes, and not try to say, like, we're going to push this way on technology. That being said, I might have just been betraying my own limited imagination, so I'm sort of open to hearing more about it, but don't know how to do it. Great. Well, I said 2 questions, so thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks to all you who have stayed through the entire conference. We really appreciate it. So this is the final panel of our Technology and Development Conference. And we're going to shift focus a bit. Unlike Jason's great keynote address and the panel before him, we're not going to be focusing on the future of work per se. We're going to be talking about this issue of data governance, this evolving issue of data governance. And of course, there's some overlap, right? The rising share of jobs that are tied to digital services, and this growing consensus. There's growing consensus that in order for digital services to provide, I would say, a healthy engine of growth and job creation, that there needs to be rules in place to govern the use, the sharing, and the collecting of data, and particularly personal data. So that's where our focus is going to be in this discussion. And although this comes at the end of our conference, this panel also is kind of a marker of a beginning for CGD, because we're kicking off a 2-year research program with generous support from the Hewlett Foundation on this issue of how do we support balanced data governance? How do we support policymakers, or how can policymakers and the development community put in place policies that reap the benefits of expanded use of digital services while also protecting against the misuse of data? And the research we conduct is going to be guided by a working group that we're kind of in the midst of putting together right now. It's going to consist of experts from development, technology, and privacy. And I'm happy that we have two of our co-chairs of the group here today, Pam Dixon, who I'll introduce you more formally later, and Benno Adulu. And since we're just launching this research program, I'm in the happy position of not having to worry about my state of ignorance on this, because we're very much in a learning mode, and I feel comfortable asking questions that may be rather basic. But that's why I'm very happy to have this panel here on stage, because we have 4 people with deep expertise, strong opinions, and they each kind of come at this issue of data governance from a different perspective and with a different lens. And they're all very nice people as well, so I think it's a good mix for a good discussion. For that reason, I'm just going to start with intros, and we'll get moving. I'll start at the end. Pam Dixon is the founder and executive director of the World Privacy Forum, which is a nonprofit organization that conducts in-depth research, analysis, and consumer education on issues related to data privacy. She also recently served as the rapporteur of the first roundtable of African data protection authorities, and I'll ask her about her experiences there later. Benno Ndulu is the academic director of the Pathways for Prosperity Commission, based at Oxford University's Blavatnik School. Earlier, he served as the governor of the Central Bank of Tanzania, where he oversaw the country's financial inclusion efforts, including by introducing agent banking and supporting growth in mobile financial services. Dhanaraj Thakur is the research director of the World Wide Web Foundation. Over the last 10 years, he's led research projects on broadband affordability, gender inequality online, and data rights, all with a focus on low and middle income countries. And finally, Priya Vora is the chief executive officer of Future State, which is a nonprofit initiative within the United Nations Foundation that advises governments and development agencies on digital policy and data empowerment. And she's also the former director of the Center for Digital Development at USAID. So the format is, I'm hoping that we can have a nice flowing discussion. I also want to leave at least 40 minutes for questions and answers, because I can just look out at the audience and I see people with strong opinions themselves on these issues, and I want to hear from them. But the format is going to be the first round of questions. I'm going to ask everyone the same question. And then the second and third round, if we make it to the third round of questions, I'm going to target questions to each specific panelist and then ask the panelists to kind of weigh in beyond that. And because I'm pretty confident we're going to have a very interesting discussion, I feel comfortable asking what is possibly a very boring definitional question to start. And I'll start with you, Priya, and then we'll go down the line. And that is, when you hear the words data governance, what do you think that actually means? Because I think it's still a rather open concept that people are kind of figuring out the boundaries of. What do you think it means? Does it meaningfully capture a distinct set of issues? And most importantly, for people in this room and maybe the development community more broadly, why should we care about data governance? So I'll start with you, Priya.
Okay, I assume this is a little bit lightning round, so I'll be quick here. So first of all, thanks for having me, and more importantly, for even having a panel on this discussion. You know, it's I hope in a year from now we have many more such discussions, and by then you'll have come up with the definition of data governance that we can all agree on. So in the meantime, I think our working definition at Future State is that data governance really means a set of policies, the institutions, and the technology systems for how national data assets get managed, get collected, used, shared, stored. And the key part in that is that it's far beyond data protection legislation. The institutions and the technology systems really are what make or break the whole situation, right? You know, you can give people rights to manage their own data or portability of data, but if the institutions for overseeing that or the systems for enabling that don't exist, it's not really meaningful. So that's our working definition. I think more importantly, what we're trying to figure out is what are we striving for when we're talking about data governance. And for us, the goals of a data governance paradigm are to make sure that more people participate in the data economy, that people have agency over their data, that there is a market of competition and choice for people, and that fundamentally there's trust in how data is used. And that pact framework is really, in our mind, the North Star.
Great, thanks. Dhanaraj.
Yes, thanks, Mike, and thanks, everyone. I feel like when you structure it like this, each of us adds a bit more piece of complexity to the answer. So maybe I'll go ahead and do that. I agree what you've said, that for us it's also about these institutions, policies, and rules that deal with the management of data. For us, what's really key is to base this on like a human rights perspective. So we're talking about human agency and protecting and promoting people's rights. I feel like the process that we are going through now also involves this kind of tension around, if you look at personal data, for example, trying to find the right balance between meeting local contextual needs when it comes to, say, personal data. For example, the extent to which people might adopt or apply the GDPR. More and more people are thinking of the G in the GDPR as global now and not necessarily general, right? And that balancing that with the interoperability needs. So we talk about data governance, right? But we have to think of it in an international scale as well. The extent to which people's rights, people can expect their rights to be protected across different borders, as well as, say, companies who might want to have some kind of uniformity, especially if they work across regions and governments. So I think that kind of tension is there as, in addition to this kind of definition of what we think of data governance is.
Great. Benno.
Yeah. when I think about data governance from a policy perspective, it's balancing between innovation for development, privacy, and security, being aware that there are important trade-offs across these three. At a level of development which is fairly low, typically when we did consultations across countries, development comes at the top, and you get second or third priorities on the other two. But still, it is important, I think, from a policy perspective to make sure that one manages the risk of either over-regulating or under-regulating data, since it is an intangible asset now, which is a big part of the economy. And it is important that one doesn't kill development in favor of simply guaranteeing privacy and security. So we are much more in that space of balancing trade-offs.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your kind invitation to be here and also be co-chair. It's a pleasure. So I have a bit of a different answer. So I see people in this room whom I've had the great pleasure of working with, and I think you'll be able to predict somewhat what I'm going to say. So I've been working in data governance for about 25 years, so I have a much longer time in this field already. So we actually, I think data governance is certainly a part of the question, but actually we really like to think of it now as knowledge governance, because what we're really trying to do is govern the knowledge that's created from data. It's not just about the data, it's about the knowledge, the actionable knowledge that can come from data, when you really think about how it's used in economies. In regards to contextualizing this, and as well as understanding the structure of how this works, there are some very good frameworks that already exist in data governance and also in knowledge governance. And the way I like to think of it is I call it the messy middle. A spigot for data use without considering risk mitigation or complexities is an issue. The spigot that says it's all protection based on human rights principles is also a problem. And again, we come back to the messy middle. And I think that what is extraordinarily important is to think in terms of systems. If we're going to think about data governance, which I prefer to think of as knowledge governance, we must think in systems and employ systems thinking. And let me give you an example of this. I think identity systems have been touched on a bit today. When you think about an identity ecosystem, you have to think of the 30 or so ecosystems that are part of that identity ecosystem. You have to think of the multinational companies and laws, the micro-identity ecosystems. And then the identity ecosystems are subsets of larger government record systems, and so on and so forth. And then those country-level systems are part of the larger global data ecosystems. And so if you start to really map out the data systems that are in place, all of a sudden, you get to see how the information, the knowledge, is interacting at a very global and rapid scale. And then you can start to think about, okay, how are we going to put some rules in place? Do we have global rules sometimes? Yeah. Do we have contextual rules sometimes that are very, very discrete and localized? Absolutely, because context is everything when it comes to this type of governance. Do we have institution-based rules? Yes. So it's yes and. It's not no, but it's yes and. So governance gets complex, but there are very good systems available to handle that complexity. But I think the most important thing to remember is that what we're really trying to achieve is responsible use of information and knowledge. And if we can achieve that by mitigating risks and by establishing good practices, I think that goes a very, very long way, and it's completely doable.
Thanks, Pam. So it seems like everyone was kind of building on a bit of a pivot by Pam at the end. And I think all the issues that each of you brought up, we're going to be touching on through the next round of questions. So I'm happy that I feel good about the questions I have here because we're going to dive into some of these issues. But I want to start with one that we didn't really talk about, and I think any discussion about data governance worth its salt today has to kind of discuss this idea of data as oil, right? The metaphor that, a lot of ink has been spilled, excuse the pun. Wow, that fell flat. A lot of ink has been spilled in this idea that this is a rather strained metaphor, right? But it's an idea that's touched a nerve among policymakers and is also it has staying power. And so I think I'll start with you, Pam. We're going to kind of go this way with the next round of questions, because I know you have very strong ideas about this issue, particularly not just data as oil, but the idea of data as something that individuals should have property rights around. So why don't we start there?
So first off, I believe trust is the new oil. I just gave a speech about this. Really, trust is the new oil. Data is a component of what gets transacted in the trust, but trust is the new oil. In terms of, if you look at the general architectures of very broad level governance, you have command and control, which is, for example, the GDPR. Then you have ownership structures, and then you can have self-governance or adaptive governance structures. And pretty much most of the human systems we make can fit into those general categories. Ownership of data, we went down this path about 20 years ago, and we found very unexpected results. So we've done a lot of studies. There's a lot of scholarly work in this area, and I can tell you that it tends to not end well, particularly in the privacy contexts. There have been a remarkable number of studies and actual unfortunate real-world situations where people have been paid for their data. So it becomes a bit unfortunate where someone for 15 cents is paid for their life data, and then that's it. There is no return on that investment for them, whereas the folks who are purchasing that data make lots and lots of money over time. So I do think that as data ownership is a very, very difficult concept, and I think there are many, many more productive and more balanced ways of approaching it that lead to a greater outcome that is more sustainable.
So maybe I'll push you on that, and then also ask other panels to touch on what are the better frames to approach these issues.
And to just add a little point to the data ownership, one of the deep problems in this is that if you have a common pool data, so for example, how about a social media platform? Who owns that data? Who owns your financial data? Do you own your financial data? I mean, the data ownership problem becomes quite difficult in an increasing world of common pool, ownership situations, which brings me to a much more of an adaptive framework where data and knowledge is governed in a mutual fashion that is agreed upon. So for example, standard setting is very helpful. Adaptive work such as Elinor Ostrom's principles of governance are very helpful in the data context, although they have to be adapted, we've found. I think these are helpful. I think some command and control structures are also helpful. It depends on the context and the jurisdiction. GDPR has come up a couple of times. GDPR, in a lot of the development contexts, GDPR has had to be rewritten so that it's actually implementable. As it is written, it is a very beautiful piece of legislation, but extraordinarily difficult to implement on the ground. And so people have had to rewrite it for their own jurisdictions. And that rewriting for their own jurisdictions, that's where all the power is. And I think that's really where if you want to call it governance, that's where the governance really is. So it's a blend, a beautiful, messy blend of all of those things. No silver bullets.
Does anyone else in the panel want to comment on this, the idea of data ownership versus maybe a rights approach or different approaches of thinking about data empowerment?
I will.
Okay.
So I agree. I mean, the analogy is fraught and I think overused. But I think there's, a couple of things to acknowledge. One is there's a real concern that that without kind of rules and institutions in place to govern data, there's just a bunch of risks that countries are suddenly exposed to, whether that's risks of the value of data being accrued to big companies in China or the US, or whether it's, privacy breaches or whatever. So, there's even though it's a fraud analogy, it's one that's sticking around because there's this kind of sense that data is worth something and needs to be figured out, and if you don't, there are a lot of downside risks. So I think in that sense, it's good to kind of jump on the bandwagon and start figuring out what is an appropriate model of data governance that is implementable. I don't know kind of the, I like this idea of mutuality. Most data is generated by at least two parties, me with Facebook or me with my bank or credit card or, vendor or whatever. And I think there are lots of, not lots, but there are some examples like Estonia or like India who acknowledge, yes, Facebook should have rights over the data and to analyze my behavior because I'm using them, but I too should be able to access my own data and port it and go somewhere else. So in that sense, we tend to like the analogy that data is more like a vote, and you should be able to have, cast a vote and share your data with a provider that you trust. And that isn't necessarily something you sell, but it is an asset, an intangible asset that you can exercise your preferences with.
May I jump in quickly? Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the value of data lies in its use. It's not just because data exists. And we know that from a development perspective, its application is what generates value, and not necessarily just sitting with it as a stock. So I think it is very important to look at the exercise of rights in the market for rights, if you want, because you cannot simply just hold onto that particular asset if it doesn't have value. So I think data portability and ownership are all quite important questions. But ultimately, we have to look at the trade-off in terms of what's the format of use. So for example, data now is very helpful in developing learning systems to improve delivery of education, learning results, health results. And you do that only if you allow that flow of information to be exercised or be used in the process of the whole system. So individual versus systems has to be one of the questions too that we need to grapple with in terms of this. Yeah.
May I jump in?
Sure.
I agree. And, the idea of mutuality is extraordinarily important. And yes, I agree completely. One of the frustrations right now in privacy is that, all of the privacy gets pushed into a privacy policy at the very end of the day. So at the end of the day, we're supposed to tick a box or check a box, right? And say, we've read and agree with privacy policy. Well, this is not real agency. I'll tell you, real agency is having a seat at the table to determine the general usage of the data. Imagine how different our world would be if Facebook invited us or a group of meaningful stakeholders represented as well by normal, everyday Joe and Jane consumers to say, here's how we do and do not want our data used. Here's what we have to say about it. Imagine if we had a seat at the table. It would be so different. And I think that is a much more meaningful framework of mutuality.
I just add to that, I also think the issue of consent around these around these services is problematic, and feel like we have a long way to go in terms of figuring out mechanisms that allow meaningful consent, so that people can understand what risks are involved with regard to privacy or their data that's being, when they apply for these services. But to go back to your first question, Mike, on the data as all things, I agree. I think most of us see this as flawed. And in my mind, what's really important are the underlying rights here. What kinds of rights are involved, whether it's rights to access, redress, data portability, things like that. To what extent does the end user have or can leverage those rights when it comes to these kinds of transactions around data? That I think is a better focus as opposed to the ownership question.
Yeah. And going back to these ideas, you mentioned the idea of data flows and making sure data is usable. I think in going to your issue of principles and rights, I think general principles and rights are fine, and also data use is fine. But the way to kind of get the balance right is to make sure that there are a number of laws that do something called routine uses, and those of you who are familiar with the Privacy Act of 1974 will know exactly what I'm talking about. There is a general agreed upon use of data that's okay, but anything beyond that is consented and requires consent. But it's only a really meaningful uses that are unexpected and have more significant consequences. But when you look at, for example, machine learning or AI data ecosystems, which are just extraordinarily complex and to some degree opaque, it's really not possible to consent to everything anymore. The systems have become too complex. And given the fact that we cannot consent to everything, we then have to have ways of having a seat at the table, ways of ensuring that there's fair data uses, but we can't control it anymore. It's out of our control, so we need better rules.
Well, and maybe a whole new set of organizations that, I have a financial manager to help me make sense of what's going on in the market. Is there some sort of equivalent on, an organization that can take my preferences around data and help me make sure that I'm only working with those organizations or those companies that are using data accordingly?
Or making sure that those companies have good rules in place
Right.
themselves and can
Right.
become trusted companies.
Yeah.
So we can demonstrate trust or have proof of trust, et cetera, yeah.
I think this gets back to what I was trying to say in the first question. Then, your laws are just one piece of the pie. You really need to, think creatively around the institutional capability, whether that's self-regulation or new government bodies or, fiduciaries or whatever it is that kind of really give meaning to data governance strategy.
So Dhanraj, since you brought up work on digital rights and the Web Foundation is kind of at the forefront of working on the issue of digital equality, including a focus on gender and women's rights over the last few years. So what are some of the main observations you've made from that experience, and how is the issue of gender relevant to data governance?
Yes, I think it's very relevant. We have been doing a lot of work on internet access as well as use from a gender frame over the last couple of years. When we think of data, I'd argue that we have certain gender gaps that exist right now. So for example, Pammy mentioned like AI systems that's meant to support government decision making. I think there was an article in The Guardian recently, the Guardian newspaper in the UK recently, that many governments in the world are incorporating AI systems to support their welfare programs. One of the problems with AI and machine learning systems is the data sets that they have, and if they are not representing the population in general, then you're going to come up with flawed outcomes. And when we think about data sets generally, especially in low and middle income countries, they're drawn from people's online activities. The problem there is we know that there's a gender gap in terms of use. Men are more likely to use the internet and be online than women. And so now you have data sets that are not representative, are not gender equal in that sense. At the same time, when you talk about how people can use their data or use public data sets or open data sets, government data, there's also a gap there because of issues around the existing wage gap, skills, patriarchal systems, all of which can limit the extent that women can actually leverage these kinds of data. So you have different kinds of gaps that exist. That on top of current patterns where there's online discrimination and bias, harassment, and so on, particularly against women. All these things come together to reflect kind of inequality that we should be aware of when we talk about data governance. If data governance is good public policy is about ensuring equal outcomes for everyone, then we cannot develop good data governance policies if we assume that these things are going to be gender neutral, because we have to acknowledge that everyone is coming from different standpoints, and particularly in many countries, there are patriarchal systems that hold women back. So I would argue that data governance, good data governance policies should be gender responsive, should be aware of these kinds of differential outcomes on men and women. And that's what, when we think about internet access and use, that's the approach we've made. I would translate that to this kind of emergent discourse as well.
I would add just one quick thing to add to what you've said. You know, one of the problems that we've had in the global South in particular, is when we go into a jurisdiction to do research and to try to find baselines for comparison, one of the problems we've had is we do not find gender disaggregated statistics. And where there are not gender disaggregated statistics, I mean, so let's say that there is a jurisdiction where there are honor killings, and let's say that there were 200 honor killings per year. Well, how many of those honor killings were women and how many were men? Because that response will change the interpretation of that data. So I agree wholeheartedly that it is quite important to consider like where these gaps are. There's also certain gaps around children and the elderly that are very significant and quite difficult to manage.
So Ben, I want to turn to you now for a question about policymaker perspectives, because you've worked closely with governments that are kind of trying to build foundational systems related to digital ID and mobile digital financial services. So these systems can make government services more effective and efficient and possibly even more transparent, but they generate a lot of data that can be tied to individuals that also represents sometimes possibly a liability. So when you think about this question, how can governments use citizen data to kind of maximize good while mitigating against those risks? And then I guess the add-on question is, the countries you're talking with most frequently, do you think that capacity exists yet, and the expertise exists, and the guidance?
Yeah, I think the starting point has to be a social license that the government should get, which balances expectations of the population in terms of transparency and privacy with the development objectives that it wants to promote. So one has to start with a good sense of where are the preferences within the society on this. It is very often unfortunate that preferences are typically imposed on a country on the basis of whatever that one has learned from the context of where research was done. And therefore, I think an assessment process in country with most of the stakeholders present would be an extremely important starting point. And that should give the government first a sense of where they should draw lines in terms of use of data and information that is gathered. I think second, in that same conversation is to realize that data when used in a system is the data that generates results. It's not necessarily purely individually applied. So I gave the example of education systems and health systems. So for example, if you adopt individualized teaching on the basis of data that has been collected, knowing exactly the strengths and weaknesses of those that you teach, you get much more effective learning outcomes. But that requires that you actually make your data available for purposes of being able to make that type of application. There are a number of pilots in the health sector of similar nature. So that information is being collected now at much lower cost and is getting bigger and bigger just because there are more and more people that are using these type of online services. So I think the capacity of the government to organize that information and be able to apply the right artificial intelligence or other methodologies in order to get the right results is extremely important. And I would underline also the importance of data portability, particularly in terms of not just having these basic foundational systems, which ID, payments, and e-government, but to be able to have these systems that speak to each other and reduce the cost of application of information across systems by reducing the barriers of access. So I think, as I said at the beginning, it's an important balancing act between those aspects of privacy and security and protecting those rights versus, getting development results when they are actually applied properly. So proportionality ultimately is quite important in application of standards. Unfortunately, standards are now being developed in a very different context and being applied at levels where these trade-offs would produce very different results. So it is, I think, important, just like proportionality in anti-money laundering and related standards have also to apply in this respect.
So a risk-based approach is kind of good. So I want to return. Yeah. Okay, we've got people teed up. Go
partly
ahead.
disagree.
Is
that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I just ask? If as you're answering, we've laid out the term data portability, but not defined it yet. And I'm conscious that some of us are coming from different backgrounds. So maybe, and I know you've worked in it. Maybe within your answer, talk about what data portability means.
Yeah, although I'm not quite going to touch on that. So I agree that trust is highly contextual, and if there's a country where there's high trust in government, then there might be more appetite to share data with government and have it be more useful for a variety of purposes. And there might be contexts where it's less so and there's more of a preference towards privacy. I think that no matter where you fall in that spectrum, it's hard to argue against systems and tools that give people insight and transparency to how their data is used. Because no matter what that agreement is today, what we need is for people to have a better sense of how their data is being used tomorrow so they can hold government accountable, so they can hold companies accountable. And right now, all these things are being done, we're all in the dark. And so I think there's one piece of this which has to be kind of uniform, which is people's rights and the tools for transparency that give them more agency. And I think within that, then there might be more or less appetite for handing over data.
And I would just,
let me just do Dhanraj and then I'll turn.
Yes, so I agree with that. In fact, what I was saying at the start was that, or I was implying is that we don't want a situation where people are benefiting from a higher level of rights, a higher standard of rights in one jurisdiction as opposed to other, which might be what's playing out now. For example, the way Facebook might negotiate with GDPR for Europeans as opposed to how they might play out for other countries. To go back to Ben's point about the implementation or what's happening on the ground, I just want to raise one quick example of some research we just released around data protection implementation in Indonesia, and the challenges around that. And yes, the issues of capacity building come about, as well as this kind of scattered perception among the people who spoke to about who is actually responsible here. So this is an institutional problem that even within the government, it's not clear who is in charge of, say, data protection. But then tied to that is the population itself. One problem that we saw emerge is in terms of, say, access to credit for a woman who would not otherwise be able to access that because their husbands might get in the way, for example. they are able to use mobile apps that provide credit. So now they have access to credit where they didn't have it before. The problem is these applications are very risky in terms of privacy. But for them, they're willing to, for them, the benefit of access to credit outweighs the risks that are presented to them in private. So when people the people we spoke to are talking about introducing better, stronger data protection regulations in that country that would apply to these people, these women, they are hesitant because for them, they're thinking that this is going to threaten their access to credit. So just to add to that complexity about how people themselves, apart from government, might react to these issues as well.
And I'm going to pile on with a slightly different take. So there are, in terms of architectures of data and knowledge governance, there is a particular model that introduces profound risk, which is the centralized model, where all the data is really held by the government in a centralized transactional database, and the services are added and hung off of that centralized transactional database. So this is the Aadhaar model. And the Aadhaar model, I do think, grew to very difficult proportions and had a lot of serious consequences. I think the Supreme Court ruling, the Aadhaar decision, got it right, where the Aadhaar is continuing, but there are new protections being added to how the data is being held and used and stored and whatnot. In the newer systems that are being built today, it's hard to think of Aadhaar as being already 10 years old, but in the newer systems that are being built today, you have a centralized registry. However, it's immediately used for deduplication only, and then that data is hashed, and then the last mile for services is quote-unquote tokenized, so that the transactions occur with privacy protections in place. You get to use the data, but you're not introducing such extraordinary human rights and privacy risks. So you get the use, and you've mitigated the risks. So I think a lot of this is looking at the system and then saying, okay, let's do a trust analysis of that system. Can this system be trusted by the people it is purporting to help and being designed to help? Let's do a very detailed, in-depth risk analysis of the system and figure out what can be mitigated. If something cannot be mitigated, then that goes into the high-risk category, and you might not be able to do it. Then you can do, finally, in the final outcome, you can do a privacy impact analysis, and you can do all of this before a single shred of data runs through beyond a pilot. So I do think that we have to take great care in mapping the data, mapping who can use the data for how long, and what general controls are there on that data, so that the transparency and human agency is retained.
So Priya, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know that Future State is working with the World Bank, doing a report that kind of looks at how that institution deals with its client countries in terms of investment and technical capacity building related to the supporting sound data governance. I know you're probably not even done with the research. You're not publishing the report till maybe spring?
I hope.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But can I ask you are there any takeaways, any lessons learned yet that speak to how the development community should be engaging with policymakers on these issues?
Well, I first want to acknowledge Mary in the room here so she can also weigh in. I mean, I think what's been important to recognize in this work with the World Bank, but also other development agencies, is that we've been pushing the digitization agenda for so many years, investing in digital IDs and digital payment systems and e-health systems and e-government, and with very little attention to what happens with the resultant data. So I think the World Bank, even by saying that they want to look more deeply into issues of data governance, is ahead of the game, frankly, and they're acknowledging that we need to care because data is a powerful tool, or the insights generated from data can either be used for better government services, for empowering people, for promoting competitive markets, or it can be used for surveillance, manipulation, control, and lead to monopolies and stifle innovation. So, I mean, it really does matter, and I think that's kind of the top line thing that we're kind of all agreeing to in this engagement. I think the harder thing to figure out is, what is it that the development community from afar can say and do to support governments. And I think, one thing that's really clear is, shopping around GDPR and saying, here, this is what you should institute is probably bad practice. And it's not implementable. And even if it is considered global DPR, it's just not practical. So there really does have to be much more thought. And frankly, we are really proposing that there be far more investment in capacity building and kind of exercising the muscle of responsive regulation, because the issues of tomorrow are going to be different from those today. And if we can make sure that through more peer networks and using kind of innovative tools like sandboxing, we can kind of help support governments as they're learning and adjusting and learning and adjusting.
So am I right in thinking like the locus of policymaking within different governments on this issue of data governance is different? I mean, do the World Bank and other institutions have to be, who are they talking to within countries?
It's a huge question. The CIO office within a Ministry of Health is almost always bigger than the national CIO's office. So you have the health and the banking sectors, which have kind of outsized influence on how data is going to be managed, and they have specialized kind of needs in both of those sectors. You also have increasing, you're seeing more data protection authorities of limited, or variable effectiveness, I would say. You have these digital teams often reporting to government. So it's really, I think that's a huge question, is who's setting the agenda, and, and how are you taking into account the kind of special needs of different sectors? I'd be interested in others' thoughts on this.
I think in the limited number of pilots that we have been doing in the context of the Pathways Commission, it is very clear that you have got to locate this type of work either at the prime ministerial level or at the presidential level, in order to make sure that it doesn't become sort of a silo-oriented initiative. So, for example, automatically most ministries in charge of innovation and communication and technology always give themselves the mandate as the leader in managing these issues. But typically, they only look at the technical front, the infrastructure-related issues, and they think that's the way it should be. But we are talking about application of technology throughout the economy, and it has to be a much larger undertaking than simply putting it under any one of those. And not only that, I think the second lesson that we are learning is that you need to have a multi-stakeholder process in getting at whatever ultimate sort of game plan the country has to follow. It can't just be a government issue. Policy is not always just government. So, and it is very important to have all the key players, the market participants, also as part of that process. And investing in that process is as important, I think, as investing in the nuts and bolts of this.
Pam.
Yes, so I do think that it's absolutely critical to have a very robust multi-stakeholder process. It really cannot be done without that. And you've got to have it be a due process, multi-stakeholder process, where there's real fairness and non-dominance of any particular stakeholder. And that's very difficult to achieve, but it is possible if you have a good constitution for whatever multi-stakeholder process that is. That being said, I do think that the data protection authorities have a very special place. Next week, it changes location each year, but next week is the convening of the International Data Protection Conference in Tirana. And I believe there's 1,200 data protection authorities who will attend. And each jurisdiction has a slightly different law, a slightly different rule, but The DPAs are really charged with knowing the law, understanding data. Some of them, particularly in the global south, are quite new, and not all jurisdictions have a DPA. But those jurisdictions that do have a DPA, in general, have a huge resource to assist both government as well as business and consumers. And that really is their remit, to really tie together all of the parts. So I think they're a very important stakeholder as well.
But can I ask, because I read the readout of the Roundtable for African Data Protection Authorities, it seemed like some of these authorities lacked authority within their countries.
You know, the truth is, here is the truth of the world. You can have law on the books, but the law is really about, you know, you will, at the end of the day, still have to get buy-in for whatever you're doing. And the DPAs will have to get buy-in. You can have all the authority in the world, but you know, you're going to have to get buy-in. We see this in almost all jurisdictions, and that buy-in is the multi-stakeholder process.
But if the top doesn't buy in, I can assure you, whatever DPA.
That's right. You have to get buy-in.
I would say, and in addition to the top, I feel like in low and middle income countries, a major sector or group of players is the telecoms industry. There's a lot, when we talk about data protection, especially here, you think of Facebook and Google, but the telecoms industry is huge because, think about it, everything you're doing online is going through them, right? I feel like, and I've been to many telecoms industry kind of meetings where this issue hardly ever comes up, because for them, particularly in low-income countries, it's about, they think data is completely different in terms of a revenue source, as in over-the-top services like YouTube and WhatsApp and so on. So the perspective is very different. So getting buy-in from that particular group, I think, would be very important, in addition to like at the top and so on.
You know what's so intriguing is that in the several jurisdictions in Africa, the DPAs are actually part of the telecom ministries, which is a huge conflict of interest, but nevertheless, you know what's happened though is that they've had to engage with each other and they've been learning from each other. So it's a very long, slow road, but it's very, very interesting.
So I'm keen to turn to the audience. I want to ask one last question because we've talked about GDPR and you all kind of shook your head. But I mean, the reality is a lot of these conversations are happening because of the GDPR, I think. I mean, there are developments on the ground that have happened that we've raised our level of concern, but I think GDPR is kind of forcing the conversation on certain countries. And you all seem to be in agreement that that type of approach just is not a fit for the low and lower middle income countries we're talking about. And I just want to get a very quick sense of why that's the case.
Okay. The GDPR was written in Europe by Europeans, largely, for a highly developed context with a lot of extraterritorial applicability. And it just did not contemplate the entirety of all economies. It just did not. And that, therefore, lies the problem. So there are certain. So let me give you one specific example. There is a requirement for something called technological proof of compliance with the law. Well, in order to do that, most companies have spent upwards of $1 billion for multinationals. For local companies, they've spent several $1 million. Typically, the numbers vary depending on what country you're talking about. But for a country to prove, for a single like SME or even larger company to prove technical compliance, they have to literally map every data point within their company and then express technically how that's working. This is a really big ask in many jurisdictions. It's expensive to do, and you'd have to map it, you'd have to pay for the technology, and so on and so forth. That's just one teeny example. There's so many more. So it needs to be adapted. I think the principles can really work. I really love what the jurisdiction of Mauritius has done. I think they have an extraordinary adaptation of GDPR. It's short, it works for their jurisdiction, and it was brilliant, really.
Great, so with that, I think I'd like to turn to the audience for questions. Got first hand here, second hand there, and anyone else? Yeah. Sorry, we'll wait for the microphone.
I am David Stosani from the World Bank as well, and you are mentioning, Michael, the piece of work that is just started. I wanted to enter a slightly different perspective. So I'm from the private sector arm of the World Bank, and one of the, first of all, one of the issues you mentioned at the start, definition of data governance, that is actually quite a critical point, because I think we see a potentially interesting boundary between data governance and data partnership, something that shouldn't really be discounted off at the start. But I wanted to ask you a slightly different question. So one of the issues that we're facing in understanding the limits of data governance is that as we work every day with private sector, one of the things that we're trying to do is to convince some of these digital platforms to actually enter markets that they consider way too complex. Typically what we do is we have somebody in Kenya or in Nigeria, and we are really praying for them to actually enter Sierra Leone or some of these other difficult markets. And we fear that excessive regulation on data may be an additional hurdle to that. So we want to make sure that the approach is balanced, especially as we prepare to advise governments in, and it's not just a binary, I'm entering, I'm not entering the market, which we have seen, it does happen. There are companies that have decided not to enter markets just because of data regulation. It's also because we're seeing that going back to the partnership point, that there is an opportunity with private sector. The data that they create can also be used for the greater good, if you want. And so we want to make sure that regulation does not distort incentives for companies to actually think of smart ways of using the data. And it is happening, and the telecom operators are doing that. And I was wondering if you had thought about this trade-off as of whether there is perhaps a staged approach to regulation depending on the maturity of the countries, because we see this as one of the key issues that we need to grapple with to make sure that the primary objective, which is to actually turbocharge the digital economy, actually gets realized. Ultimately, there's no point regulating data if there's no data to start with. So this is really a question that we need to sort of face in the next few months.
So maybe we'll take a handful, 2 or 3. We have one in the back, and then Caroline up front, and then we'll.
Yeah, hi, thank you. My question is, what technologies, policies, or institutions do you see as showing promise or potential when it comes to positive impact for data governance? So put differently, where should we be doubling down our efforts to do right by this term that we're still trying to define, but that we know is extremely important? So
that's a great question.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you. I wanted to sort of follow on a bit from this point about how to avoid excessive regulation, and I think that was a little bit what Benno was talking about, the trade-offs for development, and to put sort of 2 different questions really to the panel. One is we've kind of said, well, the data, what is the data value, or what's a good analogy? Maybe it's not the oil. Another one that has been used a lot is data as sunlight. In other words, it's non-exclusive. And what's so why do we think there's a special value just in that raw material? Sunlight helps plants to grow, but it doesn't, if it helps one plant, it doesn't stop it helping another plant. And that, I think, goes to Benno's point that it's in the use of the data that value is created. And I think it's very important for that element to be brought out. I also liked Priya's definition or comment that it's like a vote and it involves trust and so on. And that, I think, raises a question about how do you do a multi-stakeholder? And the nice thing about saying it's like a vote is that does mirror the idea that there are many, many hundreds of thousands, millions of people with a vote, and you can't actually organize them into a room other than through the political process, which leads to a government, and why should you have anything other than the government with businesses, in this case, that are being asked to control in a certain way? So that's one question. And then the other one is, in a way, maybe more fundamental. What is the problem that regulation is supposed to address. And I think people get very confused about that. Sometimes it's a sense that, well, there's something of value here and it's being stolen from people and taken out of the country and it ought not to be. And then you lead to data localization questions or to question about taxation and so on and so on. And then sometimes it's more specifically about privacy. And then I think it is more around data portability, transparency, and leaving it to people's, this goes to Dhanaraj's comment about the Indonesia question. Yes, the person, I mean, I give away my data to all sorts of people and all sorts of institutions because it makes my life easier. I'm perfectly, I don't want somebody to say that that can't happen. I want there to be a credit score for me. I want there to be online banking. And I think that we've got too tied up often in the sense that there is something bad about what's going on. And I think we should be more specific about what is the problem that any rules and regulations are seeking to address and try to focus it quite narrowly on those. Thanks.
Great. Yeah. So why don't we start with Caroline's great question, then we'll kind of work backwards through the rest, make sure we hit on everyone's.
I'm going to kind of address all of them at once. So I would just submit to you that I think that there's a lot of data science out there that has a different point of view than actually a lot of you have articulated. So those of us who've been working in data governance for a couple of decades have had to go through all of this. And multi-stakeholder, let's start with multi-stakeholder processes. They're very, very important because data is contextual. When you look at the data systems and you actually do the science of the data, it goes everywhere, but it's interconnected. You can't pull a chair out of this room and not affect the other chairs. So for example, you were talking about individual control of data in terms of you give your data and whatnot. But you know, the data systems are too large for that now. We have lost the ability to individually control or have meaningful impacts on all of the data systems around us. And therein lies the real problem in policy. So I would submit to you, it's not about regulation. It's not about control. It's about building institutions and mechanisms of trust. Why have you given your data away? It's because you trust that institution and the procedures in place. So sometimes regulations work. Sometimes ownership works, but sometimes also adaptive forms of governance work that are much more flexible, and it has to be taken in context. And this is why you need multi-stakeholder processes that are very robust, because if you look at the data ecosystems, you and I are part of the data ecosystems, we should have a vote at the table. So you create multi-stakeholders that are representative of certain categories of stakeholders. Government usually has the most, and also private businesses, commercials, both the public and the private sector. But there's also other experts. For example, if you're doing a health process, you're going to want to have private hospitals, you're going to want to have physicians, you'll want to have patient representatives, you'll want to have all the people who really have a dog in the race, if you will. So I do think that the vision of regulation is I think, I don't think it's something to be afraid of. It's not about regulation. It's about taking the tools that are, taking the arrows that are in the quiver and using the right arrow for the right situation. There used to be a real silver bullet approach of, and it's what the GDPR has done. This regulation will solve all of our data problems. No, actually, it just made them more complicated. So we find ourselves with this big law up here, which does have extraterritorial applicability, which is a huge problem for companies trying to do trade and economic trade. It is an economic barrier. It's a trade barrier, right? So putting that aside, what do you do on the ground? It's what you do on the ground that really matters. And you had made a question in regards to, you know, someone in Kenya wants to work, for example, in Sierra Leone. It doesn't, there is not necessarily, if you're protecting data in a way that mitigates risk for both the government and for groups of people and for individuals, for all of the stakeholders, it doesn't mean you're going to have regulation. You might have adaptive rules that they themselves have set up and created mutually. I think we need to look creatively at this and ensure that the goals are being met. But I don't see data as having a good use or a bad use. It simply has uses. And there's a huge, complex continuum of these uses. And we have to be careful because you can have good and bad uses simultaneously. It's so complicated. But I think that in a complicated world, we have to have a lot of solutions that are agreed upon mutually and have a lot of buy-in. I don't know if I touched enough on your question, but we can always talk later.
Yeah, I think, let me share my, my views as a former regulator, and partly because I think a lot of the data is being generated as an exhaust from the system of delivering and using services. And, you know, first you have to have the ability to collect that information, organize it, and make some good uses to it. In the regulatory world, I think it's more the question of risk assessment and trying to mitigate that risk. In dealing with anti-money laundering and terrorism in the financial world, there are global standards that have been set. We know they have been set at a level that probably addresses capabilities to deal with this set of questions in a very, very different type of level of development from a good number of where some of us are. And we made a big, I think, pitch for proportionality, partly because we need to assess the type of risk at the levels of engagement and income and transactions, right? And appropriately develop solutions for that. So countries were required to do national risk assessments so that they can appropriately place their own levels of risk on what needs to be done in relation to the standards as sort of the vision. And I think similarly, it should be possible to do that also in this context. Yeah, we have to do that risk assessment as a starting point and be able to then design interventions and regulatory instruments that, you know, fits the situation. Yeah. It can't just be irrespective of. Yeah. Yeah.
Rather of you two, I know we still have a question hanging out on kind of technological solutions that might be of assistance in solving some of these problems.
So I was just going to touch, maybe not on that question, but
okay.
the other questions on the problem, which is good. What is, you know, we don't want to be trying to come up with policy solutions looking for a problem, but what is the issue here? And I think one of the issues is around trust, which everybody keeps talking about. There are people who are becoming more disenchanted, users who are becoming more disenchanted with their online experiences because of a range of issues around data breaches, harassment, doxing, all these kinds of things. Particularly like in the U.S., Pew has reported that there's decline in trust in the internet in this country. Right, and so what's needed then is, you know, people like that will look for what kinds of protections do they have, what kind of recourse will they have, and that's where some elements of regulation will come in, whether through various kinds of authorities and so on. Half the world is actually offline, not using the internet. It's like almost 4 billion people. But when we think about when they start to come online, these issues that we're talking about now will actually grow exponentially, I think, in these bigger countries. And we will need to have some kind of ideas of how to continue those protections in those countries as well. On the point about regulation, as in trying to balance that excessive regulation with investments, attract companies. So I hear the point, and I appreciate that there is a need to get investment and get companies, you know, working in these countries, providing data services and so on. I would just kind of hesitate where we fall into this trap of having different standards around rights for data governance across different countries. So going back to the point made earlier, I think several of us have made that we should have some kind of uniformity there. And that should still enable investment and still should be able to attract investment. I think in the sense that where you have uniformity, it is an attraction for investors when you don't have to deal with different kinds of regulations, completely different regulations in different jurisdictions.
Priya, do you?
Yeah, I guess, when you talk about data, it's so easy to stay up in the ether around these risks and, the erosion of the social compact and all this sort of stuff. I'm more of a development person, so I think the reason I care about this is because, as Dhanaraj was saying, half the world is offline, and the next billion who come online, they're going to be people who are generating data as they interact with their mobile provider or bank or, however the data is getting generated. And the question is, how do you translate that into an asset that helps them improve their lives? So you might give your data away for free and, it's fine, but because it's not yours, you're not actually able to, and maybe you don't need it, but in many parts of the world, to be able to take your data and be able to say to a bank, hey, I'm credit worthy. Look at who my friends are. Look at how I top up my mobile phone every week consistently. Look at kind of who I am with this data. Give me a loan, give me a job, give me a, there's a lot of services that can be directly unlocked if you can prove who you are and kind of the behavior that you demonstrate and the responsibility you demonstrate. And I think that's real development, impact right there. So we care about it because of these bigger issues, but I think there's a development angle that too often we're missing when we're talking about data governance. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'd say about, the point around Sierra Leone is coherence across countries matters. Sierra Leone may not have the market heft to negotiate with big tech companies and be able to set in place a kind of privacy-heavy set of data regulations that's inconsistent with the rest of the world. But if you take Africa as a whole, soon the population will be larger than China. Half the population of Africa is under the age of 25. It's a thriving, continent that together represents a really powerful market block. So I think there's an opportunity to work across countries, maybe using the regional economic communities or something else to, establish what's the Africa data agenda that together can, have a little more negotiating power with tech companies. I'd lastly just end with the private sector, of course, is important, but it doesn't kind of start and end with big tech. There are lots of small and medium enterprises, lots of other types of companies that can benefit from data. So establishing structures that expand the use of data, that open up data for more uses is great for the innovation economy. It's great for a variety of companies. And we don't need to just kind of be single-mindedly focused on, what will Google do if kind of thing.
So as a conscientious moderator, I don't want to leave a question stranded, so I'm going to try again. I was surprised no one picked up the questions on technical, let's say not technological solutions, maybe technical solutions to how we can, what are ways we can drive down the cost of, or make regulation more efficient in this space, or the relationship between individuals and the companies, the platforms they're using. And I thought someone might take up the point on data fiduciaries, which is almost as open a concept as data governance is. No one did, but I thought I would try to tee it up to see if anyone does want to take that on.
So this is a question I'm asked about once a week right now in regards to legislation in the United States. So we had to work out a lot of, when we put out a policy, we've done research, it's fact-based. It's not just, rhetoric or theory. And I think it's really important to understand that the data fiduciary model is really difficult. And I'd like to see that model piloted somewhere, and then I'll have a much better ability to say, okay, let's see how this works. But
can you define the model for people that might be?
Data fiduciary, it depends on who you talk to in Congress right now. I think probably the most cohesive model I would say is Schatz right now, Senator Schatz. I would encourage you to look at the legislation. Does he have legislation printed out? If it's public yet, to take a look at that. If not, the conversation around data fiduciaries is that companies have a responsibility. Some of the proposed regulation puts extraordinary responsibility on the CEO, including potential criminal penalties when there is data misuse, et cetera. So one thing I wanted to bring up with every question is this. I think it's extraordinarily important that we move away from punitive approaches in terms of all of this governance. You know, strict liability approaches where you do something wrong and it's not a cycle of continual improvement, it's a cycle of punishment. And you know, in the developing economies, you really want a cycle of improvement where you say, okay, you know, you had a big data breach and guess what? There was a lot of fraud as a result of this and these people had stolen identities. How can we make this better for next time? Instead of, you did this, let's punish you and give you a huge fine that you can't afford and put you out of business. So I think we have to look at the punitive structure versus the, how do we make a continual process of improvement, more like the Demings, the cycle, et cetera. But in regard, let me take a shot at the institutionalization of this. I think there are many technical models for doing data governance and knowledge governance. And what model works is going to be dependent on the context that that model is used in and the context of the entity that is managing and working with that model. And if the people within that jurisdiction want and use it and accept it, I think your idea of proportionality is absolutely essential. And I still think we need broad principles with you know, adaptation according to the context that those are being used in. This exact same thing flows with technology. I don't like to think of technology as something completely different. It's just, you know, it's like, it's part of the tool set now. It's not, you know, it's just a big part of it. It's hard to pull it apart as something separate.
Thanks. So I think we have time for one more round of questions if anyone has any. Kevin?
Hi.
Anyone else?
Thank you. Kevin O'Neill from the Rockefeller Foundation. I wanted to ask about making the case for good data governance. I think to some degree in rooms like this, it's almost taken as a given. But what are the evidence? What is the state of the evidence? What are the carrots and sticks that can make those prime ministers and presidents care and those stakeholders care about this when they're facing a crowded development agenda with many pressing problems and in which data governance might be viewed as sand in the gears, or where they're seeing models of data use from China, from Tanzania, from wherever that are perhaps not the model of data governance, that are a model of data governance, but not the kind that we might want to see.
Thanks. That's a great question. David, and then Kyle, and I think we'll wrap up. And then one more, and we'll wrap up for questions.
David Medine, CGAP. There's been a lot of talk about global. G is not as global and cross-border. One example of data governance are data localization rules, which seem to restrict, they restrict data flow across borders, but they also restrict other things like sharing for counterterrorism efforts, for innovation, for bringing in outside players into the marketplace. What are your views about data localization as a form of governance? And if you oppose it, how do you convince governments that it's not in their long-term interest to adopt those types of rules?
Great. One here and then one.
So Kyle Navis, I work here at CGD. I'm curious, thinking about behavioral surplus. So much of the revenue made by tech companies and much of the consternation around them is coming out of their exploitation of the data exhaust. Should governments be using the behavioral surplus and the data that they're collecting on their citizens? Are there appropriate uses for that? Should there be limits? And who should be the one to maybe set those limits or be looking at them?
And then one more.
James Rameth, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Maybe as a corollary to the question from the back earlier, if there aren't models or technical solutions that we put forward as especially promising, are there specific areas that we would call out as kind of gaps or specific debates that we would highlight that need to be answered?
Okay, so Pri, why don't you respond to the first question and Pam to the last, and then we'll work on Pal's question.
Yeah, so maybe, so Future State helped do the landscaping of over 100 digital policymakers, primarily in emerging markets earlier this year. Jonathan here led that research. When we asked the question, what are your kind of biggest priorities when it comes to data and technology, broadband and jobs and skills were the top two primary goals and concerns. The next two were data privacy and data sharing or data interoperability. So when we looked at the data at first glance, we were thinking, well, gosh, demand for issues of data governance are farther down the totem pole. When you add those two categories up around data sharing, data privacy, it actually, and just call that data governance, it suddenly jumps to the top of the list. All to say that, I think 2 years ago, this was maybe still so new. Most digital 5-year digital plans don't talk very much about data governance. They might talk about cybersecurity, but really not kind of this issue of data interoperability and data privacy. But I think you'll see in the next set of 5-year plans, many of them more will. So I think demand is growing. What's also interesting from that study that we did was that when it comes to broadband needs and when it came to jobs and skills around technology, the request from policymakers was really clear. We need more financing, and with the financing, we know what to do with it. When it came to the issues of data sharing and data privacy, it was all over the map, which is, I think, to say this is a new issue. The requests for support are not just financing, but it's really technical assistance, standard setting, more research, what are consent models that work? It's a whole range of things that people are asking for. So I think it's an issue that's only going to grow in importance and for which there is real demand.
So the roundtable is going to answer your question, so I'll address that there. Your question, I believe it was you, yes, it's a very intriguing question. Thank you for asking it. So we spent a lot of time on that question. So I'm going to give you a very specific use case answer because it'll just show you the way the fact pattern lays out, and I love a fact pattern. So are you familiar with the Andhra Pradesh Real-Time Governance Center? Okay. So you've probably spent a lot of time on the Andhra Pradesh dashboard. If any of you are not familiar with the Andhra Pradesh Real-Time Governance Center, I recommend it to you to take a look at it. It's very important. Basically, they in India and Andhra Pradesh, the state, actually there's two now. It was split, but anyhow, there's two actually real-time governance centers. But what they've done is they've taken largely aggregate data, and they're using it to provide real-time statistics for anyone who cares to see it of what's happening in that jurisdiction, and it's quite extraordinary. In the developed world, it's quite similar to what FINRA is doing in a real-time way, for those who are familiar with it. So you asked about the touch points and the pain points of that. Really, it's not that it's there. That it's there is not a privacy problem. The pain point is, what does de-identification mean in this context, and can the data ever be re-identified, and what are the specific risks with that particular form and format of de-identification? And then the other risk and very serious pain point is, what are the rules around re-identifying data when there are problems that need to be solved? What are the procedural protections in place for that? And are there any legal protections in place? There may not be any legal protections, and where that is absent, you can create procedural protections and local rules that work. So I do think that that's a very good example. So the pain point with a lot of these real-time governance systems, and it exists elsewhere, is what does de-identified mean? Is this a simple hash that, takes this long to re-identify? Is it true de-identification where it cannot ever be re-identified? What is the decision? And that's actually a very difficult decision, because sometimes if there's let's say that there's a trouble spot where there's a lot of particular type of, perhaps there's a high murder rate in a jurisdiction or a little pocket. Well, maybe you want to dig down further into that, and maybe you want to get to a particular level of re-identification, maybe not to an individual level, but maybe a district level. What are the rules, and how can you prove that you've been following the rules to protect people? And then there were some other things mentioned, but I think we're running long, so I'm going to skip it and we can talk more.
Benno?
Yeah, I think we are just at the beginning of understanding these processes. The same way technology is just getting us into that space. Right? So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think it's important to recognize that we cannot have all those answers, so to speak. But let me take only one of the questions, which is why should policymakers care about this at all? When you look at a number of developing countries now, one thing that has caught their attention is this question of significant economic presence, which is not generating the revenue it should generate for the country concerned. So taxation issues have become really powerful sort of in the minds of policymakers, because that's one other part of the resource, because given that revenue generation and incomes are moving more and more into that space, if you don't keep up with that, your tax base also will definitely have challenges to deal with. So that's one. Second, I think as these systems are coming up on the digital front, there are questions of security and questions of pilferage into the systems, which are really bothering authorities. And they feel they have the obligation to protect the citizens on that. So on the score of security, virtually, I don't think that's, you have a major task to get them to pay attention to. I think it's on the question of privacy and transparency in the political economy sense. They have an interest, but in the other way, depending on where they're positioned as far as transparency and related issues are concerned. But I should add, I think increasingly, with all these little pilots which are providing solutions for health questions, education questions, etc., all of them using and applying data, I think the value is being seen from that developmentally. And that's where the question of the trade-off with privacy and security actually comes through. I don't know, I just thought I would describe putting myself exactly where most of these policymakers now are. Yeah, but they're just at the beginning of that, to understand and to get a good sense of what they need to be able to govern in all those senses. I think is still a long journey.
Dhanaraj, you get the last word.
Sure. So the question about innovations, I think we kind of addressed. Pam talked about fiduciaries. There's issues around data collaboratives, data trusts, which are all new, worth researching and understanding more. Data portability, like Future State had a great seminar on that. These are all new issues. what I think, for me, the question that came out is around, why, what's the use case for data governance? I think it comes back to, is really important. So to kind of complement what Ben said in his response to that, I would maybe spin it back to what you had originally started with, what's the relevance to practitioners in the development space. And when you look at ICT for the information communication technology for development, there's an emphasis on technological solutions to development problems, but in reality, ICT for D, as the definition states, is really meant to address information and communication problems, not political, social, institutional problems. In my mind, this is where data governance can really increase the efficacy of ICT for D, because we can address issues around privacy, data protection, but also improving the rights and protecting people's rights in the application of these technical solutions. So I see that coming in as strengthening ICT for D, who, and I've been involved in it, we often get kind of too focused on technical solutions solving everything when we know that's not the reality. But here is an opportunity then for data governance. And so in response to people have asked, I think that is something that's one way we can look on it.
Great, thanks. So thank you all the panelists. It was really an excellent discussion, I think. And I think I'm going to steal a line that Priya said to me yesterday, that you can't distinguish between or differentiate between data governance and governance more broadly. And that's one of my big takeaways from this panel. And the second is the idea of the messy middle. I found the conversation, I'm nowhere closer on any answers for any of these things, but I think I found it clarifying enough that my next round of questions will be better. So, and I hope you and the audience are kind of left in a similar place. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you, audience.
Thank you.
Good.